Greetings, everybody, to the second big debate on the rules for Retrograde's channel of the summer. Today, we have two gentlemen debating a question, a facet of the SSPX debate, central to the church, central to SSPX and the post-conciliar world, that I've never heard. I've never heard it debated. I'm not sure that it's ever been had out on any public forum, and it surrounds the question of indefectibility. The question being the existence of the SSPX either implicitly and or explicitly countermanding the indefectibility promise of the Roman Catholic Church, the mark of the church, if you will, promised by our Lord in Matthew's gospel. So we have two gentlemen debating either side of that. On the one side, against the society, we have Pinesap taking the positive here. The counter does, as a matter of affirmative fact, countermand the indefectibility of the church. And on the other side, we have XboxLive Republican, who is arguing no, the existence of SSPX and its creatures does not implicitly, explicitly countermand the indefectibility promise of the Roman Catholic Church. Guys, thanks for joining us today. I'm eager to get underway. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks.
I'm doing excellent.
Ready to debate, I hope. What we're going to do,
Absolutely.
what we're going to do for folks today is a format as follows: 5-minute openings, because I have so many times made the mistake of being a part of debates with openings that are overly capacious, too long. That does no one any good. People want to hear debate, and a 5-minute opening is, I think, sufficient. So we'll do 25-minute rebuttals on either side after that, 25-minute cross exams after the rebuttals, and 5-minute closings. So each side has an hour to speak, diminished or attenuated only by the amount of minutes on cross-ex that either side pledges to the other side. Hey, answer this question, take some of my 25 minutes. Okay, so we have been struggling with a unique auditory problem. This came up last summer on Elijah's channel when I was doing the debate. Rather than kick the can down the road for 60 or 90 minutes, which sometimes it takes to solve these, we're just gonna, since it's a one-sided talk, there will only be monologue most of the time through this thing. We're just gonna proceed, and we'll try to fix it as we go along. But we wanted to get underway. Resolved the existence of the Society of St. Pius X implicitly and or explicitly countermands the indefectibility of the Catholic Church. And I will read a definition, a 1950s pre-conciliar Catholic encyclopedia definition, as follows: the quality of unfailingness in the Church, her constitution and ministration, promised by Jesus Christ in the words, I'm with you through all the days that are coming until the consummation, the last line, I believe, in Matthew's gospel. Her indefectibility is seen externally by her triumph over the most terrible trials and dangers, and her abounding life and health after 1900 years of history. Internally, it has preserved her supernatural life and channels of grace intact through all the dangerous possibilities arising from human indifference, carelessness, and ill will. This is probably especially on point for our debate today. This special providence of God is technically called assistencia. We are aware of it both by faith and sight, but the manner in which it works is a matter of speculation, which is interesting. It leaves open that speculative component, things like today's debate. So, do either of you guys have any questions, comments, or demurs before we get underway?
No, I think we should be straightforward.
Okay, how about you? You good, Xbox?
Nope, that's good.
Okay, so in a resolution, we will start with the pro side, and the pro side is you, Pinesap. So without further ado, we'll get started on your 5-minute opening before coming to the 5-minute opening of Xbox Live. So
Fantastic. Just let me know when to start.
okay, I'll give you a what's a meaningful warning? I'll give you a 20-second warning when you're at 4 minutes 40 seconds. We'll do 20-second warnings today.
Perfect.
Okay, let's go for it. The clock is yours. The mic is yours anytime you begin.
Between all the denominations and Christian sects that dot the face of the earth, one central attribute of the Catholic Church is what ultimately made me and millions of other converts decide to cross the Tiber: indefectibility. We often in the life of the church discuss the infallibility of the church, but we fail to appreciate what gives infallibility its life and breath, this essential aspect of Christ's church. No doubt in our time, amidst the crises and storms that plague the church, many are thrown into despair or disbelief of this part of our Catholic faith. But the solution that the Society of St. Pius X and Archbishop Lefebvre offers sadly does not engage with the correct understanding of this aspect of Christ's church. It is not simply that they deny the indefectibility of particular prelates, episcopal conferences, or entire individual churches. They have accused the Apostolic See itself of being guilty of the stain of neo-Protestantism and neo-modernism that requires them to take extreme measures of disobedience to the Holy See. While certainly not every utterance from the mouth of Peter is to be treated with the infallibility due alone to solemn pronouncements, the habitual error the SSPX accuses 7 popes and an entire ecumenical council participating in is untenable with how the church understands herself and her indefectible nature. Not a few preconciliar theologians take great issue and exception to this massive distortion of indefectibility, including Dom Paul Now, whose study on the magisterium is sold by Angelus Press itself. Now, in being the closest preconciliar theologian to believe what the SSPX affirms about novelty in the magisterium, goes on in a footnote to claim, in agreement with the famous Bossuet, I believe his nickname was the Eagle of Meaux, that such novelty does not happen more than twice or thrice in 1,000 years, chiding against the affirmation of habitual error on the part of the SSPX. Now doesn't stop there, however. He goes on to say, quote, "The most serious danger is not that of overestimating the teachings of the magisterium, but rather that of disturbing the confidence and adhesion of the faithful. It would be particularly dangerous to contrast the solemn magisterium with the ordinary one, according to the 2 indiscriminating categories of fallible and infallible. So forgetting the wise warning which the faculty of Paris gave in 1682, whatever opinion one may profess on the infallibility of the Pope, it is just as disrespectful to proclaim publicly that he can be wrong, as to say to children, your parents may be lying to you. What more reliable teacher could one put forward to those who wish to possess the exact doctrine of Christ than the one whom the Master has affirmed, he who listens to you listens to me, on whom also he has built his church, so that it may remain unshaken till the end of time." End quote. It is this kind of dissonance with the preconciliar understanding of indefectibility that leads to Sedevacantists rightfully pointing out the inconsistency in the Society's position and wrongly leading its adherents into the heresy of Sedevacantism. In pointing out this inconsistency myself, I in no way wish to destroy the Society or its supporters, but rather I appreciate and uplift the holy desire that they have to preserve tradition in the Catholic Church with the correct assurance our holy faith gives us that this tradition will never depart from the Apostolic See, and thus the entire Church of Christ. St. Ambrose remarked best when he said, it is to Peter that he says, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. Where Peter is, there is the church. And where the church, no death is there, but life eternal. My only desire in this debate is to let Christ calm the storm in the hearts of those disturbed by the times we live in, so that the peace he gives us may be our battle cry in the fight for holy tradition and the new counter-reformation taking place in God's holy church. May those who support the SSPX join us in this holy endeavor so that we may walk together in adoring our Lord and his immaculate bride. And that is the end of my opening statement.
Next up, we have the opening statement by you, Xbox.
Sure, thank you. Since the introductions are short, I'm going to save some of my substantive arguments for the rebuttal and instead focus on considerations to frame the debate. So the resolution, as I understand it, is whether the doctrine of the church's indefectibility rules out certain claims made by the SSPX. And my argument is modest. I think Catholics are bound to affirm the indefectibility of the church, but there's uncertainty about what indefectibility materially involves. We can't presume to know what providence will permit without very strong reason to conclude that God's promise rules something out, even if this is pious to hope. So to begin with, I know that we agreed not to get into substantive claims of the SSPX, and I don't intend to, but I do think it's important to keep in mind background context for evaluating competing theories. So I'm going to assume that a substantial number of people listening to this debate find some of the SSPX's complaints about the nature of the crisis of the church at least credible or plausible on face. And if that's the case, we have to show that there's a theory, or it would be advantageous to show that one of our theories is compatible with those claims and that it's a live option for a Catholic, that it's not ruled out as impossible. By contrast, I think Pinesap faces a steeper burden of proof. He needs to rule out any alternative, and that means demonstrating that his strong interpretation of indefectibility is either theologically certain or overwhelmingly favored by a preponderance of the evidence. In other words, if you think the SSPX's diagnosis of the crisis is credible on face, that's strong evidence for a view of indefectibility that's compatible with that data. And Pinesap is going to have to show that Catholics are definitely committed to a stronger view and rules out this hypothesis. So in my view, indefectibility needs to be understood teleologically. So the essential mission of the church is the salvation of souls, and the ordinary means of salvation, the sacramental instruments of grace, will persist until the end. That requires that the constitutional essentials of the church, the priesthood, the episcopacy, the sacraments, and the Orthodox faith, in other words, the visible church, will endure until the end. The indefectibility of the church effectively means the perpetuity of the church as a whole, but that's compatible with serious failures of particular organs of the church. Large portions of the church could fall into heresy, ecclesiastical authorities could fail in their duties, sow confusion or error, they could even attempt to teach heresy. I think the basic problem in the strong view is that it conflates the whole church with one part of the church, namely the supreme visible part of the church, the Pope and the bishops. But indefectibility pertains primarily to the church as a whole, not to an individual part, except insofar as those parts conform themselves to the church as a whole. So I take the alternative view that the supreme ecclesiastical authorities, the Pope and the bishops together with him, are preserved from certain kinds of error in their public capacities, and this means that some of their acts are protected by the charism of infallibility from the kind of defects the SSPX alleges, as I take that to be Pinesap's view. I admit that there are theological authorities that favor his view, increasingly in the late 19th century and the early modern period, but there's also serious evidence for my interpretation. And given the way I framed the opening of this debate, if the arguments are inconclusive, I don't think Pinesap has shown that the SSPX's claims are ruled out. So I'll exposit this view more in the rebuttals, but I think in addition to the fact that the more modest interpretation is more epistemically humble and therefore should be favored because we shouldn't presume more than we know, it's also supported by more historical evidence. I think especially in the high medieval period, they admit all sorts of cases of papal error and even papal heresy, even papal apostasy. So for much of church history, respected theologians and canonists accepted as a fact ecclesiastical defects that are comparable to those alleged by the SSPX, papal heresy, errors taught in councils, failures of governance, etc. And whether or not those claims are admitted as true as a matter of the historical record, the fact that they were widely accepted, that they were unanimously admitted among the high medieval canonists, suggests that the prevailing view of indefectibility at that time, in the High Middle Ages, for example, did not rule them out. And if that's the case, that the prevailing view of indefectibility at the height of Christendom, the high medieval period, it allowed such failures of the ecclesiastical authorities, then I think it's at least a plausible view. We can't rule it out as obviously theologically certain that this view is false. So if a traditional understanding of indefectibility leaves room for those defects, then I think it's a live option for us. And Pinesap's view is not theologically certain. it's not favored by a preponderance of the evidence. And that means the SSPX's claims are compatible with doctrine, with the doctrine of indefectibility. So some of this will hinge on which claims precisely the SSPX do you think compromise the question of indefectibility. And I imagine that's something that'll come up in the rebuttals or maybe in the cross-examination. But yeah, so that's the basic thrust of my argument.
We will proceed on to rebuttals. Either of you have, both of you have up to 25 minutes for rebuttals. Cross-examination, I'm quite certain you'll use the full 25. Don't feel pressure to meet the 25-minute mark. If you don't meet it on rebuttal, that's more common. Okay, so we go back to Pinesap. We'll begin your 25-minute rebuttal period now.
Excellent. So Xbox expounded a lot on his view of the indefectibility of the church or what have you. And I think there's actually a lot more concordance and agreement amongst him and myself than it might initially seem. For instance, and this gets a little bit in the recognize and resist position, but I'm not going to go too far down that rabbit trail. Initially, when I had left the Society of St. Pius X, I was emphatically against any manifestation of R&R whatsoever. But upon discovering some of the hagiographies of St. Catherine of Siena, St. Bruno of Cologne, St. Columbanus, and various figures in the life of the church and in church history, I realized that the view is a lot more nuanced. However, in those examples of recognizing a pope but maybe resisting certain acts, they were very particular instances, and they weren't to this sort of gravity or extent that the Society of St. Pius X promotes. Archbishop Lefebvre in his writings really goes in sort of an overextension that I think really any saint, save maybe Columbanus, who even when Columbanus writing to which talking a bit. Be back. Can you hear me? Oh, I think you're muted, Tim.
You're back now. No,
okay, we're back.
Okay, we're back. Sorry, I think it lagged for a bit.
the Icone secret agents send their regards. They're trying to lag my section. No, I'm just playing. But needless to say, St. Columbanus, for instance, were to affirm like his example of saying that like Pope Vigilius fell into error during the Second Council of Constantinople. Well,
you're lagging again.
That group of I don't know. On my end?
Is it on my end or?
Yeah, that was you specific.
Well,
that's weird. Here, let me minimize some tabs. Maybe this will help. Okay. Hopefully that does not happen again. Sorry about that. So I don't know if anyone missed it, but if we were to take St. Columbanus's view, or essentially his actions during his life regarding Pope Vigilius and the Second Council of Constantinople, we run into a massive problem, because not only did he essentially deny the sort of indefectibility of the papal seat, even though he was kind of inconsistent in his view, but he also denied the Second Council of Constantinople being free from error. So he really not only in some ways kind of chided against papal infallibility, but also conciliar infallibility as well. Archbishop Lefebvre has some statements, and I'll try to refer to all of them, but like in his declaration of 1974, he says, "We hold fast with all our hearts and with all our soul to Catholic Rome, guardian of the Catholic faith and of the traditions necessary to preserve this faith, to eternal Rome, mistress of wisdom and truth. We refuse, on the other hand, and have always refused to follow the Rome of neo-modernist and neo-Protestant tendencies, which were so clearly evident in the Second Vatican Council and after the Council in all the reforms that issued from it. No authority, not even the highest in the hierarchy, can force us to abandon or diminish our Catholic faith, so clearly expressed and professed by the church's magisterium for 19 centuries. The SSPX's website, at least I got this from the Canadian website, goes on to say, unfortunately, some, though not by no means all, of the teachings of the Second Vatican Council contradict the constant teaching of the Church. The priests of the society oppose these novel teachings, not because of a personal resentment towards the Council, but because they are contrary to the Church's teaching throughout the centuries. And Archbishop Lefebvre went on to talk about sort of his view of the infallibility of the ordinary magisterium. And he said, what is the criterion to judge whether the ordinary magisterium is infallible or not? It is fidelity to the whole of tradition. In the event of its not conforming to tradition, we are not even bound to submit to the decrees of the Holy Father himself. The same applies to the Council. When it adheres to tradition, it must be obeyed since it represents the ordinary magisterium. But in the events of its introducing measures, which are not in accord with tradition, there is far greater freedom of choice. We should therefore have no fear of assessing facts today, because we cannot allow ourselves to be swept along on the wave of modernism, which would put our faith at risk and turn us unwillingly into Protestants. I will just be blunt. I don't know how you can square statements like that with the tradition of the church or with really any preconciliar theologian. For instance, Monsignor Van Noort and Cardinal Franzelin himself wrote of really sort of the errors of the old Catholics and trying to appeal to the Vincentian canon for the preservation of tradition. And they write that one of the inconsistencies about appealing to that canon is appealing to that canon entails something that's not been declared on by the magisterium itself yet, but that when the magisterium declares on an issue, it is settled in such a way that it's put to rest any doubt, and that there's this divine assurance that even if we're talking about, like, say, the ordinary magisterium, there's not going to be this grave error bound to the minds of all the faithful. When Archbishop Lefebvre or the society makes statements like the Second Vatican Council maybe wasn't just, ambiguous on some points or what have you, which is perfectly fine. We could say that of, say, like Lateran V, that tried to issue reforms for the life of the church, but ultimately, despite the council being orthodox, was unsuccessful in reforming the life of the church. It would be another thing to say that Lateran V was guilty of heresy or error, the same way that the society affirms that the Second Vatican Council has been guilty of error or heresy and has been upheld for 7 pontificates. This actually kind of gets to a dilemma that an old mentor of mine, Jeremiah Bannister, brought up regarding sedevacantism, in which there seems to be this indeterminate amount of time and this crisis of sort of epistemic authority and understanding when would we, quote, return to tradition according to the society's dictates. For instance, the SSPX resistance broke off from the contemporary organization of the society because they felt like even having any sort of rapprochement with Rome or conversation with them was already caving into modernism enough. So if the SSPX, hypothetically at a further date, decided that whatever the Vatican's ruling was, it was perfectly concordant with tradition, who's to say that a group of bishops or a group of the faithful of the society break off and they're the true adherents to tradition, contrary to now what the society determines? There's a massive epistemological pitfall that is easily reconcilable if you understand that the Apostolic See is never going to habitually fall into error the way that preconciliar theologians have always affirmed, even though statements of the ordinary magisterium in of themselves and statements, especially of the authentic magisterium, do not carry the mark of infallibility. It is to say that they're not also going to be habitually reaffirming a grave error the way that Archbishop Lefebvre seems to affirm in his writings that would make one Protestant or a modernist. It's the tendency of oftentimes society adherents to reject any post-conciliar statements, but I think Donum Veritatis, when it talks about the idea that though we may individually kind of disagree with the prudential ruling from the Holy See, such as that on like the death penalty or what have you, it would be mistaken to affirm that the Holy See, even in prudential matters, could be habitually mistaken over and over and over again. I mean, even in the case of Honorius, right, which I think is like kind of the massive example of papal error that we have in history, his error essentially, and I take a more maximal view of the case of Honorius. And I'm trying to remember, he wrote a book, I think it's called Responding to the Claims of Bishop Gore. It's referred to by Eric Ybarra all the time. Great Benedictine English theologian. It could be possibly even said that Honorius erred in the exercise of his non-definitive magisterium, right, or the authentic magisterium. But even then, it was a case where that was not reaffirmed by his successor, right? Even John the 22nd, in denying the beatific vision during his lifetime, rescinded his own judgment, and his successor, Benedict XII, affirmed the beatific vision as a dogma of our faith. So that seems to lend itself more to what Dom Paul now talks about in his understanding that even if there may be these moments of novelties that come up, similar to his agreement with Bossuet, it would be something that would be very rare, and it would be something that would almost immediately be quelled either during that pontificate or immediately after. I don't see in the tradition and life of the church how you can square that away with 7 pontificates, especially upholding an ecumenical council that had the largest representation in church history and all the agreement of the bishops and the agreement of, again, the popes that presided over it and the subsequent popes. At that point, you lose sort of the locus of authority. You lose sort of the loci, the focus of authority in the Catholic Church, which is the Apostolic See. And I do agree with Xbox, and actually Ludwig Ott has a wonderful enunciation that individual churches can fall away from the faith and are not participants in indefectibility. I mean, me and him would both agree. Just look at Germany right now. I mean, I would not say that we share a religion with them at all at this point. But all that is to say is that when the SSPX refers to the life of the church, if their contention was just individual churches, there would be no disagreement on my part or on the part of many who adhere to the Apostolic See, but rather they are chiding against the apostolic throne of Peter itself and saying that not only has this apostolic throne erred, but that an entire ecumenical council approved by this apostolic throne and the entire episcopate and 7 popes, 7 successors of Peter have all reaffirmed this habitual error. Dr. John Joy, who is a magnificent theologian, probably one of the best, if not the best writer on the magisterium to date, affirms that habitual error is not possible with the magisterium, that you can definitely, in his essay on infallible safety from 1 Peter 5, you could maybe have moments where it might actually be from his disputed questions on papal infallibility, but nonetheless, you could have moments where a pope could have a lapse or a novelty or what have you in the lower exercise of the magisterium. But to say that that is something that, again, would be reaffirmed by multiple successors is something that would call into question that indefectibility of the faith. And I worry really that this view of indefectibility matches not so much the Catholic view of not only the indefectibility of the Apostolic See, but also kind of the sensus fidelium, the sense of the faithful, right? But also lends itself more towards sort of the Eastern Orthodox view of epistemology of like sobernost, right? I believe Komiakov was the one who upheld this view, which is sort of in the progressing of theosis and sort of the inner dwelling of the Holy Spirit, you really only have this kind of infallibility amongst a group of the faithful, and it can be basically just lay people and an individual bishop. So there's this sort of like loss of visibility. There's this loss of real clear visibility that I think someone like St. Ambrose, on the other hand, provides us, where he says, where Peter is, there is the church. If we know we're with the Church of Rome, we're with God. If we know we're away from the Church of Rome, we know we're not with God. But Archbishop Lefebvre in his own writings, and I've just scratched the surface. I mean, he talks about an open letter to confuse Catholics openly about a future council and a future pope possibly like declaring these popes to be heretics and, sort of ruling out their pontificates to begin with. And this is even affirmed by sedevacantists like Father Cicada, who knew Archbishop Lefebvre and talked about during his life how inconsistent he was on the question of sedevacantism. Him and Bishop de Castro Mayer at one point would kind of lean more in a Fraternity of St. Peter direction, where they thought the council was fully reconcilable with tradition, and just there were these maybe difficulties or ambiguities at the time. And then on the other hand, just straight up denying the really sort of the protection or the divine protection over the Apostolic See, and basically saying that the contemporary pontiffs were like antichrists, essentially. And I think sedevacantists look at this and they say, well, hey, if this is what you're affirming, all these popes are heretics, all these popes are modernists, then they can't be true popes, right? And that's more concordant with sort of the manualist and canonist tradition than the view that the society has, where it's like, we reject contemporary canonizations, we reject any liturgical reform or liturgical life whatsoever, any sort of subsequent acts of the magisterium. I mean, even like great encyclicals like Veritatis Splendor, if I'm not mistaken, the SSPX has even tried to attribute things like naturalism to such a monumental encyclical that chides against sort of like situational ethics and chides against people who deny moral absolutism. So all this is to say is that indefectibility becomes suddenly, in the view of the society, this amorphous concept, this concept of, well, there's a group of the faithful and maybe some bishops somewhere that are preserving the faith, a lot more akin to, say, like the view that like Mark of Ephesus would have had during the Council of Florence, right? Than anything that's Catholic, where, even if the Apostolic See may be negligent in properly stamping out a heresy, as we could see in the life of the church throughout history, or might not be doing enough, certainly to say that is one thing. To say that it is neo-modernist and neo-Protestant, and, we can't really be sure of like the rights that the church provides us because they're bastard priests, they're bastard rites, they're bastard sacraments, is to call into question the integrity and the safety of our faith at that point. And so that's really my contention with the SSPX. I don't necessarily, I tend to actually take, like I said, a much more maximalist view of, like, say, Pope Honorius's heresy, or I'm familiar with the canonist tradition from like Gratian, or even the words of Pope Hadrian II during, I believe that was the, was that the 8th Ecumenical Council or the 7th? I could go back and look at my notes. But Pope Hadrian II about inferiors judging their superior, or Pope Innocent III's, I believe it was during his consecration mass, his papal consecration mass, where he said that the only time that a pope can be judged is for heresy. I can grant all that, and I think actually the contemporary scholarship from like someone like Arnaldo de Silveira on papal heresy has been very, very, very good, and a lot more detailed than even what we've had in the past. But again, I don't really see, and I would challenge Xbox to answer this question, because I've seemingly asked this of many SSPX supporters, and I never seem to get a clear answer. How do you square, again, 7 pontificates and an ecumenical council all upholding dangerous error, right? Not just teaching something that's like reformable and may still be like safe for the faithful to adhere to, even if it's not completely correct, right? As like is the view of like Francelin, or I believe even Belliot, but something that is like dangerously erroneous to the point where if I am to follow the Apostolic See, I'm guilty of essentially error that's going to send my soul to hell. I really don't see how, in that view, the gates of hell have not prevailed against the church. It just seems that at that point, the indefectibility that one might affirm is one that is kind of obscured and a lot more similar to, again, like Khomyakov's view of Sobernost or Mark of Ephesus's view of like, one true bishop throughout the world carrying on the true faith, or even the Jansenists during the Synod of Pistoia that seem to affirm that, in our day, truths of the faith have been obscured, and that some of the church's reforms actually can lead souls to damnation or hell. Two propositions both condemned by Pius VI, and that condemnation reaffirmed by Gregory XVI, and if I'm not mistaken, Leo XIII. Likewise, Tim, how am I doing on time?
You're rounding the bend to 20 minutes. So you have 5 minutes and 15 seconds left.
Excellent. Likewise, it's very interesting. I'm sure Xbox has read this book, but there's this book by Yves Congar called The Case of Lefebvre. And I was interested to read in that book the interaction between Archbishop Scheer, who was a German archbishop after the first, during the time of the First Vatican Council, and Ignaz von Dollinger, in which Scheer says, "Let us now labor for the church." And Dollinger responds, "Yes, for the church of old." And Scheer responds with an answer that actually very much sounds like something that our Holy Father Pope Benedict XVI said, where he said, "There's one church, always continuous throughout time," right? Past, present, and future. And Dollinger responds with this this sort of statement that they've changed the faith, they've departed from the ancient faith. Every single time I've read a condemnation under Pius IX, and you can read this in the Papal Teachings on the Church, a collection by some of the, I believe, Benedictine monks of Solms, right? If you read that period of time and the condemnations that especially Blessed Pius IX issued of the old Catholics, their errors, and especially like their appeal to the communitorium of St. Vincent of Lérins, very much reads like he is condemning much of the propositions upheld by the Society of St. Pius X. This appeal to, the Apostolic See has gone astray from tradition. It's abandoned tradition. We're the true purveyors and the true conservators of tradition. And him saying that why would there be any lack of solidity in the Apostolic See who guarantees and confirms tradition, right? This is something that even St. Paul VI brought up during his life in letters to Archbishop Lefebvre, where he says, you accuse me of being a modernist and not upholding tradition, but he's like, you negate the fact that the magisterium that, I'm sort of the head of, right? The magisterial teaching office of the church is the one that confirms, protects, and guards the deposit of faith. So to accuse it of departing from that same faith is, again, to have an issue of a lack of authority and a lack of breakdown of authority. I mean, like I said, it's not that the church can't go through periods of obscurity where there's like still a true pope, such as the Great Western Schism. I know Salaverry engaged with that in his work on the Church of Christ. But to say that only the church would be known by people who have read, esoteric works, maybe even untranslated by St. Robert Bellarmine, Cardinal Cajetan, and like Juan de Torquemada, only they could know the true church. And, Grandma Schmidt, who all she knows is to go to the chapel and pray her rosary, seems to be a breakdown of, again, the rock of Christ that Christ founded his church on, right? The Church of Christ is supposed to be located by even the most simple of faithful and the most educated of faithful. But in this way, it kind of seems to be more like Ronald Knox's enthusiasm, where suddenly the faithful become this group of esoteric theologians that are given, I guess, the grace enough to like understand where the true faith is, contrary to the rest of the world's Catholics that all they know, they're just going to their local chapel, they're going to their local church and just trying to live their Catholic faith to the best of their ability. I just really don't see from an epistemological standpoint how the SSPX can claim they uphold indefectibility, but then deny it, again, in regards to the Apostolic See especially, and the magisterium in such a monumental way that really seems to break down that indefectibility. And with that, I think that's my rebuttal.
Okay, nice. You have 1 minute left, but that was a good use of time. Connor, Xbox, your rebuttal, please. And we'll start at 0. You have 25 minutes.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thanks. So I'm pleased to see that we actually see more eye to eye than one might think. And I suspect in the cross-examination, we'll get into precisely the areas where we clash. So it seems that some of the disagreement may center on issues like the ethics of disobedience in cases of putative papal error, as well as precisely what the SSPX objections to the post-conciliar magisterium are. Because maybe I'm a moderate because I actually accept much of the post-conciliar magisterium, and I think you do owe it a presumptive duty of intellectual assent. I think JP2's Donum Veritatis is actually very good at clarifying the conditions under which you can legitimately refuse assent to doctrines that have been proposed by the magisterium. So I think that'll come up in cross-examination. But to reiterate the framing with which I opened the debate, my interpretation is that indefectibility effectively means the perpetual existence of the visible church, where this involves the preservation of what is essential to her mission, which is compatible with widespread failure of its particular organs. So there are authorities that favor Pinesap's view. I just don't think that they're theologically certain. So like Van Noort, for example, who says all sorts of things are theologically certain, but are contradicted, I think, by prior manualists from his own time, as well as canonists of the high medieval period. So here's some evidence that I want to present for a revised view of indefectibility, which is far weaker than what Pinesap holds. And this evidence for this view insists upon the continued existence of the visible church, but permits the sorts of failures of the particular organs of the church that the SSPX charges. So first, this is a post-conciliar source, is Cardinal Dulles, who argues, quote, the perpetuity or indefectibility, note he identifies the two, of the church involves her preservation from errors. This does not mean that the faithful or their pastors cannot be mistaken in some of their opinions, but that to the extent that they are in full communion with the church, their faith will be unsullied, end quote. So two things are worth noting here. First, Dulles straightforwardly identifies indefectibility with perpetuity, and he infers from this that the church is infallible or preserved from error, but he holds that this extends to individual pastors, which presumably includes also the supreme pastor of the church, only to the extent that they are in communion with, that is to say, they conform themselves to the rule of the church. So now, here's some further exposition from Father Louis Boyer, I think that's how you pronounce it, who's close friends with, at the time, Cardinal Ratzinger. He argues that the church, quote, remains and will remain up to the last day, stained by the numberless sins of her ministers and her faithful indeed, betrayed by the ever-possible defection, not only of her individual ministers taken individually, but also of all the particular churches taken individually, outside of which she nonetheless does not have any existence. Despite everything, it is an unshakable element of the Christian faith that the entire church cannot fail in this manner. Even if this would only be in some faithful people united around a handful of bishops, the church, one church, will remain faithful to Christ at the end of the ages, even if it were only so small a flock that her existence and survival would seem insignificant. She will never lose the faith, end quote. So here's the argument that indefectibility inheres in the whole church, which is compatible with the failure of each particular church, presumably even the Diocese of Rome, and each individual pastor, presumably even the Pope. Here's a quote by Father Matthias Scheben, who admits, quote, the interior faith of individual members, even of the Pope and the bishops, may fail, but it is impossible for the faith of the whole to fail as in the whole Mass, end quote. Now, he goes on, I admit, to defend a stronger view of indefectibility that's closer to Pinesap's, but we have, in this case, a post-Vatican I theologian admitting the possibility of interior papal defection, the loss of faith in the Pope. Such a view is also held for existence by the Jesuit neo-scholastic Palmieri. Another clear example is Heinrich Kley's treatise on the church from 1847, and he was definitely an ultramontane conservative. He writes, quote, a temporary local defection from the church does not militate against this character of the church, that is, indefectibility. The history of the world oscillates. The church also has her oscillations. Great was the defection from the church, great the contraction of its existence, the occultation of its powers during the reign of Arianism. The same might be said of the 12th, 15th, and 16th centuries, and the same shall be said of the period immediately preceding the coming of Christ to judgment. The church, during every period of relative occultation, has within itself the material of future manifestation. That it is impossible that the church should ever disappear from the world, we are taught by the words of our Lord, upon this rock, etc. And behold, I am with you all days, even unto the end of the world. And then he says later, if the church were to fail, the work of redemption would be frustrated. If Christ's words cannot pass away, neither can his church, which is the embodiment of his word, end quote. So all this might strike us as odd. First, early church history is replete with talk of the never-failing faith of Rome. And second, this is rooted in the words of Christ from the gospel. For example, in Luke 22:32, I have prayed for thee, Simon, that your faith will not fail. And in Matthew 16:18, thou art Peter, and on this rock I shall build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. It sounds like Peter, and therefore the line of popes represented in him, cannot lose the faith, perhaps even interiorly, and that the Roman see, of which he is the head, cannot fail. So here, let's look at how the medievals understood Rome. As Alan Finister has argued in his excellent book, The Iron Scepter of the Son of Man, Romanitas is a traditional mark of the church, but this was not understood to mean that the church is simply equated with the diocese of Rome. Rather, Romanitas signifies the universality of the church as a visible whole with a visible head, which is essentially constituted from Rome. So in some contexts, when theologians, medievals, talk about Rome, they literally mean the city of Rome. In some contexts, they mean the apostolic see, represented by the hierarchy in Rome. In others, they mean the Latin Patriarchy of the West. And finally, they sometimes simply mean the universal church as a whole. The authors just mentioned above suggest that it is only the final meaning, the universal church, that is truly indefectible. But Rome, in the first senses, the particular place, its ecclesiastical authorities, etc., can err grievously and lose the faith. So here's some medieval evidence. In his Summa, Huguccio, who is a leading canonist and the teacher of Pope Innocent III, who, for what it's worth, represented the high point of medieval papalism, argued that the apostolic church has never erred. This is a quote. There's an objection considering Pope Anastasius. He's talking about Anastasius II, who was universally regarded as a heretic and an apostate in the medieval church. Whether or not that's true, he was regarded that way. He continues in the quote. Perhaps this speaks of the faith of the universal church, which has never erred. For although the Roman Pope has sometimes erred, this does not mean that the Roman Church has, which is understood to be not him alone, but all the faithful. For the church is the aggregate of the faithful. If it does not exist in Rome, it exists in Gaul or wherever the faithful are. That the church can cease to be will never happen, for it was said to Peter, and in the person of Peter of the universal church, that your faith shall not fail. End quote. So for what it's worth, Pope Innocent III, whom Huguccio taught, wrote in Sermon 2 of his consecration, quote, the faith is so necessary to me that, well, for other sins I have God alone as my judge. For that sin alone, which I might commit against the faith, that is heresy, I could be judged by the church. End quote. Here's more examples from medieval canonists. Johannes Teutonicus, writing in the 13th century, holds the same view. He cites the example of Anastasius II. His quote is almost verbatim what Huguccio says. Laurentius Hispanus, who is another canonist and bishop of Orense, writing in the 13th century Glossa Palentina, says, quote, although the Pope who can be judged for heresy has erred, the Roman or Catholic Church, which is understood as the congregation of all Catholics, has not erred, end quote. Alanos, who is an English canonist in the 15th century, said, quote, even though the Pope erred, the faith endured in the Church, which is the congregation of all Catholics, end quote. Now, recall the quote from Dulles, with which I opened my rebuttal, that pastors of the Church are protected from failure when they are in communion. By this, I understand him not to mean the juridical fact that someone is recognized in communion with Rome, but that they are inerrant when they conform their minds to the Church as the rule of faith. This, I think, is the proper understanding of the sensus fidelium, which Pope Benedict XVI called, quote, a supernatural instinct connatural with the object of faith itself, by which the faithful recognize what belongs to sacred tradition. So, as evidence, consider Hermann of Schildesche, who is a 14th century Augustinian master of canon law. He writes, quote, the Pope's decision is founded on the Catholic Church, which cannot err or fall away from the infallible truth, just as the judgment of the head is rooted in the body. Thus, the Pope will never make a false judgment in such things or err if he is well integrated into the body of the Church, end quote. This view finds its famous expression in St. Antoninus of Florence, that the Pope is not infallible of himself, but, quote, when he makes use of the advice and assistance of the Church Universal, end quote. So you might think that this is ruled out by Vatican I, which explicitly rejects a consultation requirement for the exercise of infallibility, but that's highly misleading. So Father Klaus Schatz, who wrote a book on papal infallibility, it's called Papal Primacy, in which he reviews Vatican I. It's positively reviewed by Eric Ibarra. He's definitely Orthodox. He claims that although the minority party at Vatican I wanted a consultation condition explicitly built into the formal criteria of infallibility and were refused this in the actual considered definition, this was not because their argument fell on deaf ears. Well, the Church in the Council rejected the position that the infallibility of the Pope required the observation of a specific procedure of consultation that was for prudential reasons. There was a general agreement at the Council, which is evident in the introduction to Pastor Aeternus, that the Pope must conform his judgment to the traditions of the universal church as a witness to the truth, and that when he fails to do so, he does not enjoy this charism. So this was accommodated in the introduction, as I mentioned, but then also exposited subsequently by Bishop Fessler and in the relatios of Bishop Gosser, who was, of course, responsible for overseeing the Pastor Aeternus. I think Lumen Gentium actually has an interesting quote on this. Lumen Gentium, paragraph 12, says, "The whole body of the faithful cannot be mistaken in belief," but this leaves open the option that many, including the hierarchy, can be. And Yves Congar is another excellent example of a post-conciliar theologian who writes on this. He says, quote, "Indefectibility means the indestructibility of the faith upon which the church is built. It permits periods of obscurity, partial or temporary forgetfulness, indeed even partial or temporary errors. The idea of the infallibility of the whole body of the faithful is tenable only if one considers them in their totality and over a sufficiently long duration of time," end quote. So if Rome designates the universal church, that is the whole body of the faithful and not solely the head of that body, what about Peter's faith? It's hard to understand how the faith could be unfailing, that is, Christ's prayer is efficacious, so what he prays for will come to pass, yet the popes, maybe even Peter himself for a time, did lose the faith. So here's what St. Augustine says in his retractions, quote, "I have said of Peter that the church is built upon him as a rock, but the word of the Lord, thou art Petrus, and on this Petra I build my church, must be understood of him whom Peter confessed as the Son of the living God. And Peter, so named after this rock, represents the person of the church founded upon this rock. For it was not said to him, thou art a rock, Petra, but thou art Peter, Petrus, and the rock was Christ, through confession of whom Peter received the name Peter." That is, Simon received the name Peter, excuse me. And in his tractate in the Gospel of John, Augustine writes, quote, "Peter, in virtue of the primacy of his apostolate, stands by a figurative generalization for the whole church. He represented the whole church, which in this world is assailed by various temptations, as if by floods and storms, yet does not fall, because it is founded upon a rock from which Peter received his name. For this rock is not so named after Peter, but Peter after the rock. For Christ was the rock upon which Peter himself was built. For other foundation no man can lay than what is laid, which is Jesus Christ." This is then emphasized by Cajetan in the early modern period, who was certainly a defender of papal primacy and the divine institution of the papacy. He writes that the power and charisms do not belong to Peter intrinsically, but quod data est Petro in persona ecclesiae, that is, the right is given to Peter in the person of the church. So medieval theologians and canonists understood an important distinction between Peter taken individually and Peter signifying the whole church, which, as the mystical body of Christ, is immune from error. Peter enjoys his prerogatives and protections in a participated manner in a very important sense. However, Peter's faith did fail because he failed. Note the distinction. The faith as such is salvific and unfailing, and we will be saved so long as we cling to it, but we individually can defect from it. Taken individually, there's a sense in which my faith can fail. I can apostatize, but the faith that I had, the faith of the universal church that I participated in for a time, is unfailing. This is how St. Bonaventure understands Luke 22:32, that Peter could fall, though the church as a whole would not be shipwrecked, he says. And in his commentary on the sentences, he insists, quote, "The universal church is not deceived, nor does she err." St. Ambrose on the Incarnation writes, quote, "Faith, therefore, is the foundation of the church, for it was not said of the flesh of Peter, but of his faith that the gates of hell shall not prevail," end quote. So there's also, worth noting, a ubiquitous medieval belief that Peter's threefold denial of Christ involved the loss of faith. He apostatized for a period, and at the foot of the cross and on Holy Saturday, the true faith in the visible church survived through Mary alone. I think this raises some interesting questions about the nature of the church and the subject of its charisms. In whom precisely did the charisms of infallibility subsist? So it's not enough to say that particular pastors can enjoy these protections. We need to identify the grounds of those protections to determine under what conditions they possess them and exercise them. Another example of a post-conciliar theologian, very esteemed by Benedict XVI, is Hans Urs von Balthasar. He makes an excellent point that the Marian principle precedes the Petrine and is the key to understanding the church. Says the church did not begin with Christ's bestowals of the keys to Peter, nor at Pentecost. It began with the incarnation, when Christ assumes humanity through Mary, who is, and this is why Mary is held to be co-redemptress, the mediator of all graces, and the archetype of the church. All holiness that the Christ has by nature, Mary has received through grace. And this is the basic distinction through which the holiness of the church itself should be understood, that the active principle of the church, that is Christ as the divine head who bestows grace, and humanity as incorporated into Christ, but mystical body of Christ, is immaculate. but that the passive principle of the church as the bride of Christ, the aggregate of human beings who are collectively sinful and subjects of sanctification, can err. So this is why the church is both completely holy, the spotless bride of Christ, and also full of sinners. So that understanding of the church as the mystical body of Christ, the visible communion of the faithful, is more fundamental than the sociological understanding of the church as an institutional hierarchy, which is, of course, divinely instituted and essential to her mission, but also derivative and serves the mission of the church. So to reiterate, I think that indefectibility needs to be understood as a property that adheres in the whole church and ensures that the whole church will retain the means of sanctification necessary for the completion of her mission. It's compatible with terrible controversies like the Arian crisis and the suffering that the church endures today. Juan de Torquemada, late medieval or early modern, I think he's like in the late 15th century, his De Ecclesia makes an interesting point, which Cardinal Journet quotes in the second volume of The Church of the Word Incarnate, that the church can sin venially but not mortally. And we should recall here what Aquinas says in the Summa Theologica. I didn't write it in my notes. I think it's in the Prima Secundae. On the distinction between venial and mortal sin, that venial sins wound but do not destroy charity. So it lacks the full character of sin because it introduces impediments to and deviation from our end, but it doesn't repudiate the end altogether. So the church can bring about difficulties for the faithful that objectively cause them to stray from their course for a time, but it will not make finally impossible the attainment of their end. It always retains the instruments of grace through which salvation is possible for the faithful. Which I think is exactly what that quote from Clay says, that the church always retains the material for its eventual renewal. We have a hierarchy, we have an episcopacy, we have the Orthodox faith preserved. The whole church is not assented to error, even if vast swaths of it have, etc. So now I just want to go through some tough cases for infallibility. There's a long list that were accepted by the medievals. Whether or not these are actually historically accurate, the medievals thought this. So that second Ephesus, which is convened by Dioscorus I, who's Patriarch of Alexandria, that was repudiated by Chalcedon 2 years later, and Leo. You could say that's not an ecumenical council because it wasn't ratified by the Pope, but it was initially received as an authoritative council in the East. Honorius appeared to endorse monothelitism, which condemned at Third Constantinople, for which he was anathematized posthumously, and Constantinople IV, particularly like the Roman Synod that preceded the council, but the canons of that synod were repeated at the council. It prescribes resistance to ecclesiastical authorities in the cases of heresy, which is included in the Gratian Decretals. It was included in canon law until 1917 or something. So whether Honorius endorsed or merely tolerated heresy is irrelevant. The fact of the matter is the medievals and the later Cajetan believed that he did. Whether it's a failure of government or heresy doesn't really matter. It's analogous to the SSPX claims. You have the case of Pope Liberius, who was pressured by Constantius II to endorse Arianism. He signed a creed that omitted the Nicene definition of Christ's consubstantiality with the Father. This was met with opposition and opposed by Saint Athanasius, who was probably invalidly excommunicated, and Hilary of Poitiers, who actually anathematized the Pope. He wrote a letter to the Pope saying, I anathematize the great prevaricator, Liberius. You have Vigilius, which has already been discussed, whether you think he was criticized for heresy or merely failures of governance. John the 22nd appeared to deny that saints enjoyed the beatific vision. He affirmed soul sleep. That contradicted the universal ordinary magisterium, for which he was accused of heresy, interestingly by William of Ockham, among others, but like almost all theologians in the West. He rescinded it prior to his death, but he nonetheless taught it publicly at his Christmas sermons, and he held to it for the better part of a year. There's a question about habitual error, which I think will come up in the rebuttals because it was corrected shortly after. You have Sixtus V, who promulgated the 16 Vulgate, which was riddled with substantive errors as the authentic translation recommended by Trent. 9 days after he died, this was rescinded and it was repudiated 2 years later by Clement VIII. Then there's Pope Eugene IV's decree to the Armenians at Florence, which erroneously taught that the matter of holy orders is the handing over the chalice, when it is in fact the laying out of hands. That was known to the patristics and was corrected later by Pius XII in Sacramentum Ordinis. Some people deny that Florence taught this as a matter of doctrine. That may be true, whatever you think, but various serious and orthodox sources, such as Cardinal Gaspari, who was Cardinal Secretary of State for Benedict XV and Pius XI, and Cardinal Van Rossum, who is the prefect for the Congregation of the Propagation of the Faith under Benedict XV and Pius XI, they believed that Florence had taught errors. That's pre-conciliar, early 20th century, very well-situated Orthodox theologians. Then, of course, although we're avoiding substantive SSPX complaints, if you defend the post-conciliar magisterium, you're going to have to live up to your own standards. So I think this is hard for Pinesap because he insists that the Holy See cannot err habitually, even in a prudential matter. And you have, for example, John Paul II saying as much in Donum Veritatis as well. But then you're going to have to make sense of Pope Francis' statements on capital punishment, which have been seemingly repeated by Pope Leo. And that contradicts Innocent III's Confession of the Waldensians, not to say the Church Fathers, the consensus of the theologians, scripture, and so on. You have Dignitatis Humanae, which appears to teach a natural right of religious liberty and immunity from coercion, which JP2 in Tertio Millennio, paragraphs 33 and 35, he cites as the basis to repent of the church's, quote, past errors and instances of infidelity, in particular, quote, the acquiescence given, especially in certain centuries, to intolerance and even the use of violence in the service of truth, end quote. That contradicts Lateran IV's prescription that secular authorities shall be admonished and induced, if necessary, this is a quote, by ecclesiastical censure to the best of their ability to exterminate in the territory subject to their jurisdiction all heretics pointed out by the church, end quote. It also contradicts Exsurge Domine's condemnation of the proposition that it is against the will of the Spirit that heretics be burned. None of this is to say that one side or the other is right, but obviously either the post-conciliar magisterium has habitually erred in its repudiation of these prior practices, or the pre-conciliar magisterium habitually erred and in fact led people into spiritually harmful mortal sin by encouraging them to commit unjust acts of religious violence. So I think that really complicates this question of prudential infallibility, or the infallibility of prudential and disciplinary decrees. It's also clear that like these decrees are not just possibly erroneous, but spiritually harmful if they lead people into objectively sinful acts, which JP2 appears to say that they did. So then that raises questions about habitual error, which I'm hesitant on this point because some of the terms are ambiguous and it's extremely speculative. So I know what habitual means in general, habitus, a stable disposition that inclines thing to act. So for example, the virtues incline the soul to meritorious acts. And obviously the church as a whole cannot habitually err. But could one part of the church, even the supreme part of the church, the Pope, for example, there are authors, modern ones, who suggest that if the Pope were to err, this would be immediately corrected, and that seems pious to hope. But I'm not sure that we can hold on to that with certainty. I also wonder how this interacts with some of the SSPX's claims, because history is quite messy. For example, many of the SSPX complaints are not that the Pope explicitly and clearly denied a doctrine like the divinity of Christ. Instead, the complaints of the documents of the Second Vatican Council and the post-conciliar magisterium are ambiguously formulated and strongly suggest error. And there's an expectation that there's an expectation of the faithful and clerics that these should be treated charitably and with due deference. So I think it's unrealistic to think that if there's a suggestion of error, the whole church would immediately repudiate it, given that we're under an expectation to treat them charitably, to assume orthodoxy unless it's unavoidable. So the insidious nature of the problem is that the error kind of cloaks itself in ambiguity, which makes correction very difficult. And that's also, I think, why conservative apologists are somewhat to blame for this. So could God permit popes to obstinately, publicly, transparently teach heresy for 1,000 years? That strikes me as very implausible. But could God allow popes to teach a heresy by ambiguity or compromise or deception for a period of 6 decades? I think we should hope not. But if you believe that is in fact happening, if you take the SSPX claims seriously, then I don't think we can rule it out as a matter of theological certainty, that it follows unavoidably from the nature of indefectibility. Trying to think, is there anything else? Also this question about the essential unity of the church. So unity, of course, is an essential mark of the church. The church is one. I think that that's primarily referring to the mystical body of Christ, because factually speaking, the church as a juridical society has often been compromised by a lack of unity. The fact of schism, for example. In the Great Western Schism, you have a case of 40 years where, due to conflict over the papacy, the church was subject to internal division. Not the mystical body of Christ, but the juridical society of the church. Suppose that popes at the present moment are in fact perfectly orthodox, but they're just widely misunderstood by plenty of Catholics who factually do affirm false doctrines. Could anyone seriously maintain that the church, including all members of the church, are perfectly manifesting this unity at present? I think clearly not.
1 minute Xbox, a little less.
Sure. So is there anything that I should bring up that I was missing? I think that more or less covers it. There's questions about the ethics of disobedience that I think will come up in the rebuttals. So if the Pope does appear to bind us or attempt to bind us to false doctrines, when are you permitted to disobey? I think that quote from Don Paul now suggests that disobedience or even the acknowledgement of apparent error is almost impermissible, which is, I think, pretty extreme and inconsistent with the preconciliar, even the preconciliar magisterium in official theology. So we'll discuss that in the rebuttals. Anyway, thank you.
Okay. Very nice rebuttals. Now for the next segment, and I feel bad interrupting anyone anytime. I guess I'll be slightly more active just to help keep the requisite short answer endemic to a cross-examination on track. But you guys have been highly genteel, so hopefully I won't be activated much. We have 25 minutes now going to Pinesap.
Sorry, just 1 second. Just a note of an audio note here. I'm trying to cancel out the echo. For some reason, every time Tim's mic is on and Connor's or Pinesap's mic is on, we have an echo. So apologies. I'll do my best to mute Tim. So if there's a little bit of an echo at first, be patient with me. And if you can't really hear Tim at first, I just want to make sure that everybody can hear Pinesap as much as he's talking. So,
yeah.
Okay.
For what it's worth, that was an enlightening rebuttal segment by both of you. So good job. All right, Pinesap, go ahead. 25 minutes.
Absolutely. I think that was a very beefy rebuttal. Are we back? Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. another lag. So that was a very beefy rebuttal. I admittedly felt as if there was some pushback on what I had said, but rather there was like different highlighting of another aspect of the faith, right? Where, Xbox seemed to affirm that there was, kind of almost this mystical aspect to the indefectibility of the church that I would actually agree with and stuff like that, especially the Marian principle being first before the Petrine principle. No disagreement there. I mean, literally, Mary is the mother of the church, and so it makes sense that she proceeds in order of sort of the principles of the church. But I think I have some kind of issues with what I see as kind of not being like an engagement with what especially the 19th century and 20th century popes had to say about this idea of indefectibility. For instance, and I'll ask Xbox on this in our cross-examine right now. There's one encyclical that Pius IX has, for instance, Blessed Pius IX has, called Graves ac Diuturne. Sorry, I'm still trying to improve my Latin. Graves ac Diuturne, where he talks about basically the seizure of churches in Switzerland on the part of old Catholics, the old Catholic heretics. And he goes on to say, this is the relevant portion in this encyclical. So he says, having violently occupied parishes and churches with apostate priests, they have not neglected any deception or cunning to lead children of the Catholic Church into wretched schism. Because it has always been especially a characteristic of heretics and schismatics to use lies and deception, these sons of darkness are to be reckoned among those the prophet spoke of. Woe to you, deserting children who have faith in the shadow of Egypt. You have rejected the world and have hoped in trickery and rebellion. They love to deceive the unwary and the innocent and to draw them into error by deception and hypocrisy. And this is the especially relevant portion. They repeatedly state openly that they do not in the least reject the Catholic Church and its visible head, but rather they are zealous for the purity of Catholic doctrine, declaring that they are heirs of the ancient faith and the only true Catholics. But in fact, they refuse to acknowledge all the divine prerogatives of the Vicar of Christ on earth and do not submit to his supreme magisterium. I would just ask Xbox on its face, I'm going to be honest, especially what we know of some of the seizure. I mean, there's that one famous seizure of one of the churches in France on the part of the SSPX that's posted about online and stuff like that. One of Archbishop Lefebvre's earliest priests, who I think died in the 70s, where they quite literally seized the church from the like lawful pastor that was there. and are saying the same things of we're the purveyors of the ancient faith, and Rome has like lost this faith, even though we recognize him as the head. I mean, I would maybe ask, do you not see kind of maybe the connection or the problem that someone like myself might have of, even though the SSPX might not affirm exactly the same errors of the old Catholics, it does seem to like kind of rhyme in history that they claim to be the ancient true Catholics, and the SSPX is kind of doing the same, especially in their view of Rome?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. So I would make 2 points in response. So one, I think that's a legitimate reason for a disposition of submission to the Roman pontiff and of initial skepticism about the SSPX. If somebody comes to you with radically revisionist claims and says these authorities in whom you have placed your trust are deceiving you and misleading you, it's not that that's impossible. You know, your father could be deceiving you and misleading you about something, but you should be initially very skeptical about that. There should be a high standard of proof. So I think that's the case of the legitimacy of material disobedience and the refusal of assent in general is like, in the same way that I think you have a high standard of proof to rule out SSPX claims, I think they have a high standard of proof to actually justify their claims. But that leads to the second point, which is, and this might sound a little bit silly, the difference is that the old Catholics are wrong and the SSPX is right. There's that old phrase that used to be put on cannons, like the King of France, called the last argument of kings, the final argument of kings is war. And I think that there's a mistaken, there's a misapprehension that the Pope or the papacy, or even the visible magisterium is a kind of like Ouija board or magic 8-ball that you can shake and get like clear answers to every doctrinal question that don't require an active interpretation on your part. And although you owe it a presumptive duty of obedience, which I think is just what the intellectual or the religious assent of intellect and will involves, there are conditions under which you can withdraw or refuse obedience and refuse assent. I think that like that will just depend upon the truth or falsehood of the SSPX claims. Obviously, Pius IX, who made a lot of very extravagant statements on ignoring excommunications or about refusal of obedience, etc. He's writing in a highly polemical context that I think has to be interpreted in light of the concrete disputes of the time. And the old Catholics are simply mistaken on it. So I don't hear Tim.
If either cross-examiner, when it's your time, wants the answer cut short, if you think it's sufficient, raise your hand and I'll jump in.
Absolutely. I want to let him expound. I wanted to let Xbox expound, but here's kind of the issue again, where I do agree that, again, Rome's not a magic 8-ball, like automatically questions of theology are just not answered lickety split. And as time has gone on and I've matured in my Catholic faith, especially reading like Matthias Schiebing and stuff like that, like I realize that is the case. But when you have statements, again, I go back to like what Archbishop Lefebvre said here in the talk from March 30th and April 18th of 1986. He said, "It is possible we may be obliged to believe this Pope is not the Pope. For 20 years, Monsignor de Castro Mayor and I preferred to wait." He also says things like, let me see here. For some time, many people, the Sede Vacantes, have been saying there is no Pope. But I think that for me, it was not yet the time to say that because it was not sure, it was not evident. Again, that's from the same article. I'm having this issue here with specifically Lefebvre, where I think Xbox, you are actually saying a lot more reasonable things about our view of obedience and what that entails. And the fact that there may be disputes in the life of the church that come up that Rome doesn't immediately answer. That's totally fine. And that is actually tenable within defectibility. But when Archbishop Lefebvre makes emphatic statements like that, saying Rome has lost the faith, and even society supporters like Battle for Truth try to put forth like sermons in English where it's like, oh, he refutes Sede Vacantism. And during that sermon, he says like, well, the Sede say we have no Pope. Well, I'm in no place to make that judgment, but basically it could be the case. I think you're playing with dangerous, extremely spiritual, harmful ambiguity there. And so I guess what I would ask you is how could we square away those statements from Archbishop Lefebvre with maybe the sort of more reasonable view that you're purveying? Because he's not even just saying what you're saying about like, there's maybe this ambiguity or this dispute coming up. but that Rome has basically lost the faith and we need to go our own way.
Yeah, so I think there are two separate questions. One about whether Rome has lost the faith and what precisely that means, and the other about Lefebvre's flirtation with sedevacantism. So my understanding is that Lefebvre did entertain this position with Bishop Castro de Meyer,
Yes.
but ultimately came down against it. And today, sedevacantism is like unanimously rejected by the SSPX. I think they'll like expel seminarians if they espouse sedevacantism. But I guess my answer is I think that Lefebvre was a very holy man who undertook practically necessary acts with great bravery under tragic circumstances into which he was forced. But I also think he could be theologically clumsy, which is like there are plenty of saints who are like naive peasant girls who don't really understand theology very well. And an example of this is like Lefebvre doubted the validity of masses that were officiated by priests who personally denied the real presence. He said that maybe they have a defective intention and they can't actually intend to do what the church prescribes. And I don't think that position is very seriously held by theologians in the society today. Lefebvre was not a canonist or a systematic theologian. Lefebvre was a missionary. So for one thing, I don't entertain sedevacantism, and I think that we can admit that Lefebvre erred in specific judgments. I think he erred from conjecture, not from heresy or not from lack of submission. Oh, did you have that? You want to interject?
I would interject there. So this is my problem again with kind of the stake that the SSPX asks of its adherents, right? So you said that, Archbishop Lefebvre was not this theologian. He was not this figure. He was a missionary to Dakar, which I totally agree with. But this whole time, I feel like we've been debating kind of epistemic uncertainty in regards to the apostolic see and indefectibility. And if this missionary who's not a theologian is asking me to stake my soul and following him into this group that could potentially lead to my damnation versus what all these preconciliar theologians and popes say about if I follow the apostolic see, I have a more sure sign of salvation. Why would I not just follow the apostolic see? Why would I stake my salvation again on this missionary from Dakar that isn't even a theologian? And even if he was, he's asking a big task of me to follow him basically into schism.
Well, I don't think that you're staking your salvation on the private opinions of Lefebvre. I think you're staking your salvation on the authority of what has been infallibly proposed by the church in prior councils, prior magisterium. It's not by Lefebvre's personal credibility. I mean, I think he was a very holy man, but it's not because he's a very holy man that I believe what he said. It's because I think, as someone who's not a theologian but has thought about the issue for a bit, I think that there are just unavoidable contradictions between the pre and post conciliar magisterium, and you're going to have to sort that out. Obviously, I think there's an assumption of deference and an assumption of or an obligation of hermeneutical charity to the post conciliar magisterium. You have to try to charitably reconstruct the intentions of the council fathers and the post conciliar popes. But if you really do think that a contradiction is unavoidable, and there are spiritual stakes to that, if you think that this doctrine is just factually unavoidably false for prior, it's been antecedently condemned and is heretical, then it should be opposed. You have to refuse assent to it. I don't think you can say, there's a classic example philosophers give. They're like, as a performative contradiction, someone says, it's raining outside, but I don't believe it. It's like, well, in the first statement, you are tacitly asserting belief that it is in fact raining outside.
Right.
I think similarly, if you believe that, for example, Dignitatis Humanae teaches a previously condemned error, we'll get into whether that's true, but people find that credible, then I think you just have to refuse assent to it by the prior, by the authority of the prior magisterium. And the SSPX identifies that or demands clarification that has not been forthcoming by the post-conciliar church.
Well, but I would disagree with that, because I do feel that Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was head of the CDF and he sent actually back the dubia to Archbishop Lefebvre's religious liberty, did quell a lot of the doubts that they had. And not to mention that when the Society of St. Vincent Ferrer came into communion with the church and they, I believe, stopped associating with the SSPX, or I can't remember. I think they were sede privationists or something. If you read in the book, I think it's Archbishop Lefebvre in the Vatican, the SSPX calls them traitors, basically, and says that they're like now modernists, and says the same thing about Fraternity of St. Peter priests as well. So my whole issue is, even though Archbishop Lefebvre could be wrong on some issues, the whole crux here is, okay, he's wrong on some issues, but what capacity is he operating in? Is he like Saliveri, where he's a theologian of the church and he's like, by no means is my opinion dogma or what have you, right? But he's in communion with the church. And like the worst that you're going to get with adhering to Saliveri's like dogmatic work is just, oh, I committed it sort of an intellectual error, right? But I was not adhering to an actual moral error. Whereas the Pope himself says the SSPX is no longer in communion with the church. They've broken from the magisterium. This is a doctrinal issue and stuff like that. And you're staking your salvation and following this man and his society into what is called by the Apostolic See a schism on the hope that they're right, yet he's wrong. Like, I guess it's like, that's such a gamble for the faithful that it kind of, to me, chides against position, which is, there's these ambiguity. Oh, did I lag out?
I think you're back.
Tim?
You're back.
Okay, we're back. You definitely take a more reasonable position, but I'm going to be honest, on the ground, even from the SSPX's pastors and sometimes largest supporters, they don't even take the position that you do. It's like they basically are willing to like follow Archbishop Lefebvre into this schism at all costs, while still granting he's just this missionary figure. Whereas again, all these preconciliar, not forget theologians like popes, are like the surest sign of unity, such as like in Sadis Cognitum by Leo XIII, is obedience to the Apostolic See. And so again, I don't really have too much of an issue with your position, Xbox, but if this is a debate over the SSPX, then ultimately I'm really engaging with the SSPX. And I just don't think that really they even hold your position. I think they're a lot more extreme in their adhesion to the idea that, again, Rome has lost the faith. We need to go our own way. And we're going to stake our claims on this guy who's not even a theologian.
Sure. Yeah. I think you bring up a lot of legitimate points. So I'll try to respond to them each individually. I'll set aside for the moment Cardinal Ratzinger's response to the dubia of Lefebvre, because I think we're just going to substantively disagree about the adequacy of his interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae. But suffice to say, I don't find it compelling. But there's a question about epistemic uncertainty. So certainly there is considerable danger of taking a stance against the ecclesial authorities as constituted by the statements of the magisterium. This is a general danger of even disobedience, let alone refusal of assent. But there's also considerable danger of endorsing heresy if it's been proposed to you. Now, I think there's questions about subjective culpability, because you might not be culpable if you take something on the authority of another person, even if it is false. You might be exculpated because it is from a motive of faith. But potentially it could lead to spiritual harm for you, or it could lead to harms as a consequence of the widespread endorsement of these heresies. An example of this, for instance, that you and I discussed earlier, is Pope Francis was thought, let's set aside whether he did say this, but Pope Francis was thought to have endorsed same-sex marriage in a public locution once. And Adrian Vermeule immediately posted on Twitter saying, now is the time to submit your intellect to your will and endorse same-sex marriage. all true Catholics, patriots assemble, or whatever. That, I think, betrays a grave spiritual danger of being of kind of like obsequiousness, I guess, being overly deferential to ecclesial authority, and thereby losing the virtue of faith. And I think that's a grave spiritual danger and a social danger.
So if I might interject, because that is a fantastic example, but I think ironically, this is what I would say, both sometimes the society supporters and ironically grave heretics, which I view Adrian Vermeule way worse than even the strongest SSPXer. I mean, you and I talked, like, I don't even consider Mike Lewis or Where Peter Is to be fellow Catholics. I think they are a completely different religion. But what I do see, and it's very telling that Matthew Levering opens his book, Vatican II, Renewal Within Tradition, from this example. I see this ecclesial naturalism on the part of sort of sometimes society supporters and those who chide against the society, where someone like a magisterial positivist like Mike Lewis or Adrian Vermeule says, well, arbitrary human authority of the Pope can just remake the faith overnight. It can just change the faith. If the Pope wakes up tomorrow and says, well, you know, the sky is blue, but I'm going to say it's green. That's just how it goes. And the SSPX almost seems to grant that reality, but then say, but we'll resist that. I feel like Catholics, on the other hand, and at least I read this in the allocutions and encyclicals of, again, all these preconciliar popes, is saying the Holy Spirit would not permit such a thing to happen, right? The Holy Spirit would not permit, again, 7 popes in an ecumenical council to teach what you yourself said earlier, like heresy, right? Because we can have maybe these temporary lapses or what have you. I mean, for instance, Thomas Hart, in a recent book that came out from Aruka Press, it was reprinted. He's a preconciliar theologian. He says about like non-infallible declarations of the Holy See, right? Are we to conclude then that the popes can make mistakes just as any other mortal men when exercising their ordinary magisterial power they teach on social questions? Theologians seem to agree that although the guarantee of infallibility applies in its strictest sense only to the exercise of the extraordinary magisterium, that is, to ex cathedra pronouncements, yet in exercising his ordinary magisterial powers, the Pope has the protection and guidance of the Holy Ghost, to the extent at least that Almighty God would not permit him to make a serious error in teaching the universal church. They argue that this providential protection is necessary of the Holy See is to fulfill its divinely appointed commission of guiding men safely and surely to their eternal destinies. Therefore, the clear and certain teaching of the popes on social questions is to be taken only as true doctrine on the points covered. The possibility of doubt or debate ceases when the Holy See has spoken definitively. That concords with Donum Veritatis, right? But then when you seem to bring up that, again, heresy could happen under 7 popes, and that same heresy, and this is what I mean by habitual error, that same heresy could be habitually reaffirmed by them, I think that just massively chides against the teaching of the church. But I'd love to hear your rebuttal to that.
Sure. Yeah. So 2 things. We can move on to this question. I did have more to say about the previous one, but we can move on if you prefer. I would admit it strains belief to think that not only could the Pope teach heresy for a time, but that several consecutive popes could reaffirm that heresy, and that the majority of the hierarchy would assent to it. That is difficult to believe. And I think the Catholics should have a presumption of skepticism towards that claim. Mm-hmm. But I do think it's kind of like what Cardinal Bellarmine said on the Roman Pontiff about the possibility of a heretical pope. That he says it's pious to believe that God's providence would not permit such a thing to happen. But then he goes on to talk about what the church's recourse would be if there were a heretical pope. And I would question whether it's theologically certain that popes will be prevented by their special graces from habitually erring or even teaching and reaffirming heresy, or if that's something that we should merely piously believe on the basis of our trust in divine providence. I would deny the former. And I would think that the second is actually a perfectly legitimate disposition to have, but then it has to make sense of the relevant evidence. So that would be, I guess, partial response.
But I would chide against that in saying that I think not even private theologians like Father Thomas Hart there, but again, like if we read the magisterium of the magisterial statements of Pius IX, Leo XIII, I think even Gregory XVI to a certain extent, and like Saint Pius X, they all seem to habitually reaffirm, ironic that word habitual comes up, that again, the Pope couldn't teach habitual error, right? That there is this kind of infallible safety to the idea that even though, and I can fully grant to you, by the way, that an individual Pope could be a heretic for sure. That's something, again, I have a more maximal view than that, than even like Pope Respecter or some of the guys online. As much respect as due to him, he's a great guy. But like, I have a much more maximal view that's approximate to your view on that. But I just don't think that that can happen for 7 popes. And I don't think that it's a matter of private speculation, but really sort of seen in the magisterium of Gregory XVI, Pius IX, Leo XIII, and St. Pius X, and even Pius XI and Pius XII subsequently. I mean, what would you respond to if they kind of are habitually saying over and over, like, this habitual error can't happen? I mean, isn't it kind of theologically certain that it can't at that point?
Well, here's an analogous case. There's an increasingly common belief in the early modern period, and especially in the post-Vatican I kind of official theologians, that although a pope might be a formal heretic, he might interiorly lose the faith, that he could never teach heresy at all in his public office, habitually or not. There are theologians who affirm that in the post-Vatican I church. And it becomes a very common belief. I think the fact that that is a widely held opinion for a time does not mean that it is part of the universal ordinary magisterium, that we are bound to hold it. It doesn't mean it's universally held. It doesn't mean it represents the consensus of the church. So let's grant, for the sake of argument, that post-conciliar theologians, that is post-Vatican I, theologians hold that popes cannot habitually err over successive papacies. And I'm not sure they explicitly claim that, but you're right, they might suggest that as a conclusion you would naturally think, given what they say. I don't think that represents the clear consensus of theologians over time. It seems the high medieval theologians took it for granted that the popes could successively, over several papacies, err. That's something we would doubt would occur, but that it could happen. I just don't think we can admit that as a theological certainty, even if it were universally held by theologians at the present moment. I don't think it represents the traditional view of the church.
But I would again challenge, like, the question is not individual papal heresy, because, I mean, again, the case of Honorius and stuff like that.
10 seconds.
Oh,
yeah.
10 seconds.
10 seconds.
Then we're good then.
One sec.
So let's flip now, and it will be Xbox cross-examining Pinesap. 25 minutes begin right now.
Sure, thank you. So I guess I can just pick up right where we left off in this question of habitual error, because I do think that this is a strong defense. This is like a major reason to be skeptical about SSPX claims. So my understanding of your position is that you admit that an individual pope could err even in his public capacity as a teacher, even potentially to the extent of teaching materially heretical doctrines for a time, right? You hold that.
I would say so, yes.
Like John the 22nd on the Beatific Vision, like that was a public sermon. It was as teacher, as potentially as universal pastor, and he erred. But you think that a pope, or perhaps the papacy through a succession of popes, is protected by habitual error. And I understand that some modern theologians, I think Palmieri, admit that a pope could teach heresy, but they hold that he would be immediately corrected, so it wouldn't be habitual. So I guess my question is, what constitutes habitual error, and what constitutes the standards for immediacy and correction? So is error habitual if it's reaffirmed by a succession of popes? Is it habitual if it's held by one and the same pope until the end? So John the 22nd, immediately prior to his death, or shortly before his death, recanted. So I think last night we may have discussed, like, well, two popes might err in a row. Francis on capital punishment, and then he seems to be reaffirmed by Leo, but not 7. And to me, it's like, well, the longer it goes on, the less plausible it gets. I admit that. But is there some clear bright line where it's like, well, this is the point where it becomes habitual?
Absolutely. What I would say is that, and I don't want to get too down the rabbit hole with capital punishment, but I will defend that a little bit. Regarding habitual error, John the 22nd held against the Beatific Vision during the course of his life. I guess you could say kind of maybe Honorius did as well. And so I don't think that reaffirming something during a single pontificate constitutes habitual error, because that's just one pope, right? That can be guilty of error or heresy. I think what it protects against is the idea that the chair of Peter would be so stained by error that, again, you would have like 5, 4, 7, multiple pontificates where the locus, the focus of faith, or the visibility of the faith that we should have towards the apostolic see and its utterances is lost. Whereas for an individual pontificate, there can be disputes that come up and stuff like that. For instance, in regards to your position, I think that Cardinal Burke and Cardinal Mueller are better expositors and representations of a truly orthodox approach to recognize and resist than I think the SSPX, because they affirm that, the Second Vatican Council didn't err, and that, the past 7 popes aren't heretics or anything like that, but that there were maybe these disputes that came up during like Pope Francis's pontificate, or that these disputes might be possible during a single pontificate. In regards to the death penalty, what I would say is that word inadmissible that Pope Francis uses, and kind of hearkening back to almost, I believe it was Pius IX's condemnation, or sorry, not Pius IX, Pius VII, his condemnation, I believe, of hangings, if I'm not mistaken, because he actually referred to that teaching, is more so the idea that the use of that language is just saying, I'm making a prudential judgment not to use something that is permitted, right? So like to not use the death penalty, rather than saying it's outright condemned in of itself, right? That somehow the church sinned by using the death penalty. And ironically, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a couple other examples to maybe clarify the point, because I'm just going to bracket for the sake of argument the nature of the statement on death penalty. Was that actually a material heresy that Pope Francis taught? Was it a prudential judgment or a claim about moral doctrine? I just am curious about what constitutes the distinction between temporary and habitual error. But here are 2 cases that do seem like cases of habitual error, chronic habitual error over papacies. So one case that I'm curious how you respond to is the Council of Florence. So Eugene IV at the Council of Florence taught that, in his decree to the Armenians, taught that the matter of holy orders is the conferral of the patent rather than the laying on of hands. And that was accepted from Florence, which is the 15th century, until the 20th century. It was corrected by Pius XII. And it was at least widely believed to have been a statement of doctrine with relation to faith, the matter of holy orders. It was not believed to be a disciplinary decree. That seems like 5 centuries of habitual error, maybe not habitual error harmful to souls, but habitual error in the magisterium. So I'm curious how you respond to that case. And then as a second example, you have, John Paul II teaches that the papacy could not habitually err even in its prudential judgments. But John Paul II condemns as spiritually harmful the disciplinary decrees of the preconciliar church, the pre-modern church, concerning the treatment of heretics, the ghettoization of Jews, the Inquisition, religious warfare, the Crusades, etc. Now, those are all defended or celebrated by the official theologians of that time for hundreds of years. It seems like the church either prudentially erred for hundreds of years in the pre-modern period, or it's habitually erred in the post-conciliar evaluation of those times, which of course is like a matter of moral teaching. So I'm curious about those 2 cases, Florence and then post-conciliar and pre-conciliar views on religious coercion.
Absolutely. So with Florence, it's so divine providence has a funny way of bringing us together. I actually was reading, because I thought you would bring that up. I was reading the article put out by John Fisher 2.0 on Florence about whether Florence erred on this issue. I will fully confess my sacramental theology is terrible. It's similar to like Trinitarian liturgical stuff. So I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert. But the language that it seems like Pius XII is using when he instituted the laying of hands as the sole matter of ordination, the language that he uses is sort of a very like conditional ruling, and it seems very careful to not admit that it's like heresy or habitual error. He says, if it was at one time necessary, even for validity by the will and command of the church, everyone knows that the church has the power to change and abrogate what she herself has established. So it seems like what he is saying there, just from a very cursory reading of it, not being an expert, that it was like licit for that like laying on of hair, what the Council of Florence ruled on. It was licit for it to occur, but that in his clarification, he has the power, per being the vicar of Christ, to like change it to the sole laying on of hands. So that's what I would say for Florence.
Could I ask a quick follow-up to that?
What did you say?
Could I ask as a quick
yeah,
follow-up
for
to
sure,
that?
for sure.
And then we can get into the second case about prudential judgments. Quick follow-up to that. So my understanding is your answer is that you deny that the magisterium had erred for hundreds of years, that it was a error of moral, of teaching for hundreds of years on the matter of holy orders. I guess my question is, I cited in my rebuttal 2 cardinals in the Roman Curia who were theological experts who thought that it was an erroneous statement of sacramental theology. And I don't mean to just say like, well, they're cardinals, so they're right.
Oh, no, no.
But the question is, do you think that in accepting that the church had erred in sacramental theology for 500 years, those 2 cardinals had implicitly denied the indefectibility of the church?
No. And actually, I would amend my answer a little bit to say, I think that low-level exercise of the magisterium, in which even though that there had been that 500-year period, I don't think that the error that they were speaking of was a grave error that separated one from the faith. So I think this is kind of what we go back to with like Franzelin or Billiot on infallible safety, where even if one adhered to what Florence had said, they would not be guilty of any sort of grave error that would have separated them from the faith. So certainly an error in that case could be permitted. Was it a grave error? No. And I deny that it's a grave error. Would you like me to answer now the St. John Paul II?
Yeah, that might be a good segue to the second part of the question, because it does suggest, the second question concerning religious violence does suggest a grave error, that it was mortally sinful. The church prescribed mortally sinful behavior, namely the persecution of religious dissenters, Jews, etc.
So it's very interesting. So St. John Paul II's, because people know online, I love defending the Inquisition, the Crusades, and all the, nitty gritty stuff that people don't like to chide against. And as a consequence, I've actually done quite a bit of research, maybe not to the fullest extent. Maybe you might have actually done more research on this than I have, but I have looked into St. John Paul II's apologies and what have you. And it's very interesting. There's a book called When the Pope Asks Forgiveness, which is out of print. It's from St. Paul's Press. It's very telling that in his apologies, he tries to kind of make a distinction between what the church officially ordained and what might have gone on during that time. In fact, when he was giving an address, I think it was like on the Vatican investigation on what went on during the Inquisition or what have you, he makes a very important distinction about like sin being attributed to the church proper, which is impossible, and then sin being attributed to individual members, like let's say Bernard of Guy going too far in a certain like torture method that he used on a particular heretic, right? That's the distinction that he draws. And I do believe that this distinction is actually upheld by, you might know this cardinal. I think you and me both love him. You know Cardinal Beefy?
No, actually. No.
Oh, he's great. In fact, I'll send you this article after this. Cardinal Giacomo Cardinal Beefy actually approached the Holy Father because he was very concerned with this apology, and he was like, "Well, Holy Father, you're not like saying that the church sinned, right?" And St. John Paul II, to his face, said, "No, I'm not saying that the church sinned. I am merely apologizing for individual sins of her members and maybe going too far in some of these exercises of like, maybe like during the Crusades, for instance, the sack of Constantinople, right?"
Could I ask just like 2 questions of clarification or 2 follow-ups on this?
Oh, for sure.
So it seems on the one hand, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what John Paul II's apology consists in. Then it's like the church itself prescribed the death penalty for heretics. In fact, in Exsurge Domine condemned the proposition. I don't actually know which degree of censure, but anathematized the proposition that is against God's will, the will of the Spirit, that heretics be burned. And like that's a discipline and a practice prescribed by the Roman Church, not by a particular inquisitor who went a little too far. Like, for one thing, like, do you think that John Paul II, in his understanding of religious liberty, accepts the legitimacy of burning heretics as a prescription of the universal church? And then the second point I wanted to bring up is, he said, like, oh, well, there's a distinction between the church proper, which is immaculate and preserved from sin, and particular members of the church who can, of course, sin. And I wonder, how does that interact with like the general view of indefectibility that I've held, that the one church, the unitary mystical body of Christ, is, of course, preserved from sin, but then the church as an aggregate of members, the juridical constitution of the church and the particular offices of the Pope and, the Grand Inquisitor and whatever, like they of course can sin, they can err,
Right.
to the degree that they don't conform themselves to the universal church. So those two questions, like, what is do we seriously think that John Paul II believed that it was morally licit to burn heretics? And second, how do you make sense of this distinction?
So even if he personally did not, I think that God maintained a respectful silence in preventing him from outright condemning the Inquisition proper as an institution, or the Crusades proper as an institution forwarded by the church. Because again, in his apology, he makes very, very, very important distinctions of like, we're apologizing for the sack of Constantinople, not just the Crusades as an institution outright, or the Inquisition as an institution outright. And he seemed very clear on making those distinctions during his life, which I think was a prompting of the Holy Spirit. Likewise, even if he during his life was to say not uphold, like we should bring back the Inquisition, this kind of goes back to Matthias Scheibing's theological notes on tradition, where at times in the life of the church, a certain teaching is not necessarily contradicted, but it's not being like currently reaffirmed by the magisterium, but it still belongs to the content of the faith. And I think that's the time that we're living in regards to, say, the Crusades or the Inquisition, where popes have been very careful to not outright condemn those institutions as belonging to the church and accusing the church of sinning herself, but may have just condemned individual acts that they saw as going too far or what have you, from particular like inquisitors or figures or what have you, which to a certain extent, I think in that lower level exercise that they're teaching, I think we can disagree with. I think that that is a disagreement that Donum Veritatis would even permit, and one that I would maybe upheld. Like, for instance, like when St. John Paul II apologized for like the burning of Jan Hus, I think we can disagree with that apology. I don't think that that places one outside the faith by any means, because I think Donum Veritatis permits that kind of disagreement. He wasn't intending to bind all the faithful to the idea of like burning Jan Hus is wrong. And so something like, I think isn't it point 78 in Exsurge Domini about burning heretics is not contrary to the will of the Holy Spirit. Am I correct on that, Xbox?
I don't remember the exact notes, but yeah.
Totally fine.
It does teach that.
I would apply Matthias Scheibing's theological notes there on tradition, where I don't think that has been outright condemned or contradicted. I think just in recent times, because especially we've not had the long arm of the state to really if we wanted to issue those kinds of condemnations of like heretics, because I certainly would have put Karl Rahner or Charles Curran on the pyre if I had my way, right? I think that has not been contradicted, but it's been kind of forgotten. And then the second question that you asked, please remind me. Sorry, I wasn't trying to be too long or laborious.
I may have forgotten
about sin in the office, right?
Oh, that's yeah.
Perfect. So I actually think that, and it's funny because I was reading when the Pope asks forgiveness the other day to prepare for this debate, and St. John Paul II himself actually refers to this address, and you're probably familiar with this. I believe it was during, I can't remember if it was during Lateran V or Trent, but Pope Adrian VI said that he and his predecessors had sinned in not properly dealing with the issues of corruption in life of the church, right? And that apology is one that I agree with, but the way that I understand that is, again, what I think we've had actually concordance agreement with during this discussion, where popes can be negligent, right? Popes can fail to condemn certain heretics. Popes can fail to properly be as strong or sort of forthright as we would like them to be. And it doesn't invalidate their papacy or make them heretics, but it does make them negligent in their office. You know, I think we can easily see this. Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So,
can I break in real fast?
Sure.
I'll pause your time. I did just want to. I was fact checking this because it's been at the front of my mind for a couple months. John Paul II's 2000 Day of Pardon included this confession concerning Christians who had used coercion. Quote, Christians have often denied the gospel, yielding to a mentality of power. They have violated the rights of ethnic groups and peoples and shown contempt for their cultures and religious traditions. It's kind of what you said, Pinesap, but I would say Cardinal Ratzinger's actions during the same ceremony supports Xbox's It acknowledged occasions when Christians, in defending truth, had resorted to, quote, methods of intolerance rather than following the gospel. And also John Paul II in 2004, in his letter concerning the International Symposium on the Inquisition, recalled the Jubilee repentance 4 years before for occasions when Christians had employed methods of intolerance and even violence. So this seems to be something other than muteness. He seems to be weighing in. I'll return to my station, my cone of silence.
For sure. Oh, Tim, are you talking? I can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, in Tertio Millennio, John Paul II lists as an error and instance of infidelity to the gospel the use of intolerance and the use of violence in the service of truth, which, without qualification, which I think isn't just about excessive coercion. But there's something else I wanted to ask. What was on my mind?
If I could refer to an instance, actually this is very relevant. It was with a society supporter. They were on the train. Albino Luciani, who became Blessed John Paul I, was talking about Dignitatis Humanae with a society supporter, and some of the examples that he brought up of things that like the council condemned in terms of religious liberty. One was actually that during the lifetime of this saintly figure was condemned, was like Blessed Charlemagne forcefully baptizing the Saxons. And Alcuin of York actually interjected and said, while it is laudatory that you're protecting the empire from this incursion of the heretical Saxons, baptism cannot be compelled, right? And so by you compelling baptism, you're breaking down the freedom for someone to truly accept God. So while I will say that phrase is kind of ambiguous, I do think that, like, for instance, Luciani's interaction there does kind of reveal to the mind that I think more, if we were to get more precise or really cut our teeth on it, it would be more examples like what Blessed Charlemagne had done with the Saxons, and less like just the institution, the Inquisition itself that was being condemned.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's a traditional view. Aquinas condemns coerced baptism. I believe Duns Scotus has like a somewhat dissident view on it. It's kind of complicated about forced baptism of children, but that is a traditional view of the church against condemned baptism. That's not novel. I'm more skeptical than you are that JP2 and the post-conciliar popes would accept the legitimacy of shedding blood in service to truth, and they're just worried about particular cases of it. I think that the condemnations are much more expansive than that. But we can set that aside because that's like a substantive question about Dignitatis Humanae.
For sure.
I guess two follow-up questions while I still have time. So one, just to start with, would accept, I think, that there's a widespread understanding of Dignitatis Humanae that is heterodox, or other post-conciliar teachings that are heterodox, that are materially heretical among the faithful and among much of the hierarchy, at least. And I don't think it's implausible to think that this is suggested by certain ambiguities in the texts themselves and by the teachings of the post-conciliar hierarchy, including the popes. So, I mean, like, do you think that that is incompatible with the indefectibility of the church, for one thing? And for another, do you think that it is plausible to infer from this that the magisterial exposition of these documents, while not containing in itself definitive heresies, nonetheless can cause spiritual harm when the confusion that it sows leads people to conclude against the traditional teachings of the faith, leads people to accept material heresies? So I guess, do you think that the exercise of the magisterium by post-conciliar popes can or has caused spiritual harm?
So, well, that's a loaded question. I don't think that the actual exercise of the magisterium of the popes themselves, in terms of saying, hey, this is what the council taught or whatever, has in of itself caused spiritual harm. But what I would say is that there is this widespread dissent, and that has caused spiritual harm, or this widespread distortion of the church's teachings. For instance, there was that heretical French catechism that was issued in the 80s. There was the Dutch catechism. There were these widespread examples of manifest dissent from the Holy Father, and such that I agree earlier, you brought up Father Louis Boyer. I agree earlier with the statement that indefectibility could mean that it is this smaller group of the faithful, but with the qualifier that they are still united around the Holy Father. And I think that's the time that we're living through, right? That's a kind of secula obscura, in my view, that we're living through, where those of us who study theology and understand these nuances understand, for instance, what the council is saying, what the popes have ruled on, but there are large sections of certain episcopates in countries such as the Netherlands, Germany, I would say Austria, sometimes Latin America, who are not teaching the true faith. And this might surprise people, I would say for those individual bishops, even those individual bishops' conferences, which is actually, this viewpoint is upheld by St. John Paul II on his ruling on episcopal conferences, it is not only licit, it is a duty and a requirement to rebel, or not rebel, but to resist their heretical teachings. So
yes, I have a question about this, actually, about the moral permissibility of dissent or refusal of assent.
Right.
So Aquinas says, this gets into the question that you asked me about, is it spiritually safe to follow the SSPX? 2 more minutes? Okay.
2 minutes.
Is it spiritually safe to follow the SSPX if you find their arguments persuasive? And I said, like, well, there's a certain standard of persuasiveness. Like, obviously, you should be a little bit suspicious when people confront you with these sorts of arguments. But Aquinas says that a person is obliged to follow his conscience, even if his conscience errs. And Cardinal Ratzinger, in his exposition of Gaudium et Spes, reaffirms this, actually. And he says this is true even when one upholds one's conscience against the properly constituted ecclesiastical authorities. So I'm curious to what extent you think that a well-formed conscience exculpates one of spiritual sin, even when one errs, for example, in refusing assent to ambiguous teachings from the popes or refusing obedience to them, when you truly do sincerely believe that they are in error and they're propagating spiritually harmful doctrines. Because it seems like the post-conciliar magisterium makes a big deal about this, Ratzinger in his exposition, and it seems also that we have earlier sources on the priority of conscience and the rights of conscience from Aquinas on this. So what do you think about that, about individual culpability? Yeah,
that's a fantastic question. So I think Grandma Schmidt, who maybe is going to a society chapel in some remote French village and she doesn't know about the condemnations of Rome or what have you, is not necessarily culpable for her error. But the people that are online who have sort of the ability to be corrected and have the ability to know better and really do go out of their way, because Xbox, you are honestly like a golden child of someone who supports the SSPX. You're kind, you're charitable. I don't mean to glaze, but we're going through Krispy Kreme, right? You're a really kind dude. I'm going to be honest, and you probably would agree with me. And there's certainly people more to my side that are not kind either. But it does seem like a lot of SSPX people. Tim, if we could just get more time for me to finish, would that be okay?
I don't mind.
I'm totally fine with him taking a minute longer, whatever. It's fine.
Yeah, it's hard to break off someone that's telling you how kind you are. So.
Yes,
either way.
But you see this sort of like heavy disdain for the Roman pontiff on a lot of these online SSPX suppositors. I mean, like Kennedy Hall and stuff like that, like just straight up is like railing on like the Vatican and like making fun of our mother, the church, getting beat when he sees like a bad liturgy. And I'm like, I think he is completely culpable for the sin of schism. But Grandma Schmidt, who just goes to the local society chapel in somewhere in rural France, I don't think has the same level of culpability. The other thing that I would, to answer the rights of conscience, contradict is that Ratzinger during his life, and I haven't studied his writings enough on this, so I will confess I'm not as maybe well formed on this subject as other people, but he was clear to distinguish that, again, conscience still needs to be well formed, because if we affirm the absolute right of conscience, then we do get someone like Charles Curran, for instance, who was excommunicated, who said, well, if a Catholic wants to disagree with the church's teaching on contraception or what have you, and his conscience permits him to do that, then he can do that. Or like Karl Rahner in Richard McCormick's collection of on dissident liberal theologians appealing to conscience, trying to bring up the German bishops' conference, basically dissenting from Humanae Vitae. So I think we have to very much be careful of, while properly honoring conscience, as St. John Henry Newman calls it, the Aboriginal Vicar of Christ, we have to also be careful to not lean into the arguments that Ronarians or Charles Curran would have used to promote dissent from traditional teachings of the church.
Sure, thanks.
Good rebuttal segment. What I would note now before we go into 5-minute closings is that these things are more tiring than the ordinary guy doesn't do intense debate under intense scrutiny with thousands of people watching. Very tiring intellectually. So I'm not going to submit anyone to the questions, which too often drag from the audience in person. Sometimes I have people call in. Folks in the chat were asking about that, but what I'll do instead is super chat, one-line questions, and address whoever you want to answer it, one or both people, and make it a question that's not only one line long, but is conducive to a 3-line or under answer, so that we can run through a bunch of them, and we'll take them for any, super chats. Okay. We will start with the 5-minute closing of you, Pinesap, and then you, Xbox.
Perfect. What I would say for my 5-minute closing is this. Xbox and I believe, have a lot more concordance in our views than maybe we initially thought. I think online, especially on the timeline, leads to us having a view of a canon of difference in our views when there really is but a puddle. And I think that he did a beautiful job during his rebuttal. And I don't think it was in contradiction to what I said, but highlighting the mystical indefectibility of the church, which is something that we meditate on as a part of our spiritual life. And I've been fully enraptured with, to the point of wanting to possibly discern religious life because of it. So he brought up, I think, rather another aspect of indefectibility rather than a contradiction of what I said. Whereas I brought up, I think, the more hierarchical aspect or the ecclesiastical aspect of what indefectibility looks like. Overall, I think that this debate has come to a conclusion where we have a lot of concordance with our views. And I think that, for my side at least, it is good for my side, or the Pope-splaining side. I hate that word so much. I don't even consider myself to be one, but the Pope-splaining side to acknowledge a lot more that there are cases, especially with lower level ecclesiastical authorities, where it is not only permissible, but actually a duty and a requirement of your Catholic faith to recognize and resist lower bishops or lower bishops' conferences. And that doesn't contradict obedience, and that doesn't contradict indefectibility. And I think for the SSPX side, I think they have to contend with the fact that obedience to the Roman pontiff specifically is a part of indefectibility, that we don't believe in this ecclesiastical or this ecclesial naturalism that Spinoza upheld, where the Pope can just remake the faith willy-nilly, but that the Holy Spirit, by his divine providence, prevents such an event from occurring. I think if both of us can acknowledge the sort of deficiencies, sometimes pertinent in our view when we maybe overcorrect or overreact, we come to the really true Catholic view, which is the seed of Peter will always be immaculate, that the rock of the church will always stand because it is built on the true rock of Christ, and that despite the heretics or wagings or wars outside and inside the church, she will always, always, always brave the storms and seas of error and confusion that try to flummox her. And so with that, I bind myself to that divine promise in the church, and I know Xbox does as well. And I was really happy with this debate to see us more come together as brothers, trying to get to the bottom of an issue, rather than as an antagonist trying to fight as if we somehow had separate faiths, which I do not believe. I believe my brother is a faithful, devout Catholic. I believe I'm the worst Catholic ever, but I am a Catholic nonetheless. And I think it is so beautiful that we can dwell in communion together and fight for holy tradition in the life of the church. And with that, my closing statement is concluded.
Okay. Xbox, you have 5 minutes starting now for your concluding statement.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so I was also pleasantly surprised by how close our opinions actually are. But I kind of I want to be a little bit manipulative here. I think that proximity actually inclines us in favor to the SSPX position, given the nature of the burden of proof that I think Pinesap faces to establish his argument. So I think Pinesap needs to show not only that there are reasons to doubt the SSPX, which I fully admit. I think that if someone comes to you saying, doubt these authorities in whom you've placed your trust, you should have a disposition of suspicion towards them. But he needs to prove, I think, that it's theologically certain that the SSPX contradicts doctrines of the church, namely that they indirectly contravene the indefectibility of the church. If he hasn't established this, then it may turn out that the SSPX is wrong, but they aren't clearly wrong or obviously wrong. So like the old Catholics, they might fail on the substance of the issues, but that requires actually delving into the meat of the issues. And we can't know ahead of time that that's impossible. So I frame the debate in terms of weighing probabilities. So there's an expression that one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens, meaning if a premise entails a conclusion, you can either affirm the premise and the conclusion or deny the conclusion and the premise, and it's left open to you. And if you evaluate either part of the inference independently, that's going to determine how you evaluate the other part. So in other words, if you think the SSPX diagnosis of the church is compelling, that's a very strong reason to prefer my view of indefectibility. But if you think the Pinesap is definitely right about indefectibility, then you're going to have to deny how the SSPX characterizes our situation today, which I think effectively means like you're going to have to deny your own lying eyes to some extent. But that, again, would have to get into the content of the issues. So I think there are two reasons why Pinesap still faces a pretty uphill battle. On the one hand, most people listening are probably going to find the SSPX claims at least plausible on face. They're serious. They're worth taking seriously. And on the other hand, Pinesap is arguing that those claims are incompatible with indefectibility, so they're ruled out as possibilities. I think that habitual failure of the hierarchy is not that hard to believe. Cardinal Bellarmine said that a heretical pope, it's pious to believe that God would not permit such a thing to happen, but it's a conceptual possibility, so we can't deny it in principle from the outset. I think similarly, the habitual failure of several popes in a sequence is hard to believe, but it's not conceptually impossible. And it presumes a lot to hold that it is certain that providence would prevent that from occurring. So I think Pinesap needs to prove that stronger claim, and I think that the weight of especially pre-19th century theologians admit much stronger fallibility in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. So bracketing the truth of the SSPX claims, we have to determine which hypothesis better explains the data. And that's ultimately going to depend upon what the audience thinks about whether the SSPX makes compelling arguments for their beliefs. So I leave that open to the audience to interpret. I want to say, related to this debate, in a recent article, Father Barret criticized the ecclesiological dualism of the SSPX for positing a distinction between two Romes, the eternal Rome, the guardian of truth, and then the merely historical Rome. And Pinesap quoted that speech by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, in which he said he was taking a stand against modernist Rome. And I don't like a lot of this talk, which some traditionalists, including members of the SSPX, engage in, of a counter church or a counterfeit church that implies a substantial difference between these two entities. And I think it is potentially spiritually dangerous. But I think one of the best quotes on this issue actually comes from a speech from Pius XII, who really represents the high point of the modern recovery of the understanding of the church as the mystical body of Christ, which begins in the 19th century. I mean, there's obviously earlier precedents for this, but this recovery begins in the 19th century and is actually a major part of post-conciliar ecclesiology. So here's what he said in 1949, after his 1943 encyclical on the mystical body of Christ. I want to quote it. "When we find ourselves before the testimonies of the Christian past, however ancient they may be, we always sense something immortal. The faith they proclaim still lives. The church to which they belong still lives, always the same throughout the centuries. It is the Church of Christ today in its visible form. If ever one day physical Rome were to collapse, if ever this same Vatican Basilica, the symbol of the one invincible, victorious Catholic Church, were to bury under its ruins the historical treasures and sacred tombs it contains, even then the church would neither be destroyed nor cracked. Christ's promise to Peter would always remain true. The papacy, the one indestructible church founded on the Pope living at that moment, would always endure. So it is that eternal Rome, in the supernatural Christian sense, is superior to historical Rome. Its nature and truth are independent of the latter." End quote. And I think that perfectly anticipates Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre's appeal to the sensus fidelium, the sense of the faithful, to recognize the sacred tradition embodied in eternal Rome, even against the pronouncements of a particular part of the church, namely the ecclesiastical hierarchy, which can err and can even lose the faith. So there's more stuff I wanted to say about conscience, but I don't have enough time. But I think that frames the conclusion of the debate. So thank you very much.
Thank you both. I'm not just saying it because this debate occasioned my channel. That was excellent by both of you. Okay, let's move on to Super Chat. If you both are game. Are you both game?
I'm totally game.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so first off, we have, let me put on the screen. W. Groiper General Pinesap, XboxLive, and Timothy Gordon for this video. May Christ bless you guys. Thank you very much for the super chat on that. Let's see. American Reform sent $10. Are not the conditions under which it is permissible to dissent from the simply authentic magisterium narrow? For example, private by competent theologians and without public dissent.
I think Wagner had a really good video on this where it does uphold what American Reform said, where you're not calling for widespread dissent against the Holy Father. And I can't remember what, I think it was a subsequent address by Ratzinger on Donum Veritatis about what kind of dissent was permissible. But I would refer to his video. It was phenomenal. And I think it kind of upholds what American Reform is saying here, which I, despite him being a set of economists, I would say that we agree on this.
Yeah, so that may well be true. I think that one would have to examine the theological reasons that are adduced for this limitation on legitimate dissent. So ordinarily, the merely authentic magisterium can err, but it can also err in relatively innocent ways that are not spiritually harmful to the faithful. The case of Florence might be an example where we think there are suggestions of error about the matter of the sacrament of holy orders, and the faithful should not be making a huge stink about this. Theologians should not be publicly calling for disrespect against, speaking disrespectfully about the Pope, or publicly calling for dissent against the Pope. And I think that what Pinesap said earlier, which, by the way, he, I think, did excellently in this debate and framed the issue well. But what he said earlier about your obligation to speak respectfully and deferentially to your authorities, whether they're ecclesiastical or natural authorities, that's true. And I think that normally does limit your dissent and public criticism of them. But if there's a grave spiritual harm, or grave harm generally, that requires dissent, then that's, I think, an extenuating circumstance. I think if the merely authentic magisterium is preaching spiritually dangerous doctrines, then that would authorize extraordinary acts of dissent.
And I think we can even see examples of sometimes an extraordinary event like that happening. I mean, like St. Bruno of Cologne is probably a really good example of that, where I believe the contention, gosh, it's been a while since I've read about it, but I think it was still with the investiture controversy. And I think he thought that Pope Paschal II was granting way too much power to basically, I think it was the Holy Roman Emperor or whoever was reigning at the time. And he in his letter says, like, Holy Father, I'm obedient to you in all things, but like, I feel like this is an error. And this is basically, I believe he said simony. So I can even kind of grant there may be extraordinary circumstances when that happens, but generally we kind of go more with like what Wagner says in his video about it being a more private engagement and more on the part of competent theologians.
Yeah, I think that there is a grave spiritual danger of like uneducated lay people popping off about these issues and speaking very disrespectfully about the Pope or the bishops. I don't appreciate that. And I think that certainly many traditionalists, SSPX, and actually like plenty of otherwise like post-conservative people who just got like, their brains were broken by Pope Francis, and speak very disrespectfully. I do think there are plenty of historical cases of public dissent. I think John the 22nd is a very good example of like widespread, basically like all of the major theologians at the University of Paris, Germany, France, and Italy did dissent publicly. And there are plenty of cases of saints who spoke like very polemically towards the Pope and other ecclesiastical authorities, to the extent that even I would be very uncomfortable doing that today.
Dude, St. Bridget of Sweden, like what she said about Pope, I think, was it Pope Julian? Like, that was crazy. That was insane. In Intervisions, you probably read that line too, right?
I might be misremembering. No, inform me. I'm curious.
I think she literally said something like the Pope deserves to die or something. I was like, wow, she's like going off, honestly. Like, I was not expecting that, but someone who, I don't know if they're Catholic, but they're kind of maybe one of those like weird niche accounts that's like revived like old heresies, like conciliarism as like a bit, posted that quote. And I was like, yeah, similar to what you said, like that does kind of make me uncomfortable to be like, Like I've seen some bad popes in history, but I don't know if I'd ever say that.
Yeah, I think like Cajetan and Suarez, possibly Bellarmine, are all willing to authorize like military resistance to the Pope and even doing physical harm to his person in the limited case. And like they have in mind like Christological errors that in some ways maybe are more central than these errors in social teaching that the SSPX imputes to the post-conciliar magisterium. But I think are like they feel much less pressing. Like, oh, you're going to kill the Pope potentially, fight a war over the relationship between Christ's two wills. So much the worse for something like religious indifferentism. But
no, absolutely. Oh, Tim, you there?
Okay. Steph was reading. Are you muted, Steph?
I think he's muted. Sorry.
No, I couldn't hear either. I think.
I'm sorry. I apologize. Mr. Keeps on Ticking sent $5. Said, "I'm a good boy in communion with the big guy, but man, people in general are so badly catechized. It's insane." Opinion on Windswept House.
So I would completely agree, and I think Xbox would agree with me. One of the massive parts of the crisis in the church is bad catechesis. Like we've got to improve it. I've been a huge proponent. Like, if you know your faith, please get involved in RCIA and help catechize like new Catholics or people coming into the church, because we can't have Susan from the parish council doing it anymore. I think there's even been really terrible local catechisms like the ones I referred to. Thankfully, I've looked a lot of them up. A lot of them have bit the dust, and now people are reading beautiful older catechisms. Like something I'm very supportive of is the Tradivox project that issued a couple years ago, where they were creating these beautiful leather-bound editions to all these old catechisms, like St. Thomas Aquinas's, the Catechism of the Council of Trent, the St. Pius X Catechism. And I think, as actually Pope Benedict said, it's beautiful to refer to those catechisms as well as the official catechism, because the faith is always the same. So if we can do that, catechesis is going to improve massively and people are going to know their faith. As for Windswept House, I'll certainly entertain reading it and stuff like that. Malachi Martin was a Philo-Semite and had some like insane Gregory Baum type views about I don't know what I can say on Tim's channel, but the certain group of people needing to convert and stuff like that. And he had like illicit relationships with women and stuff like that while he was apparently a priest. So I don't really tend to view him that highly. I've also heard he was a compulsive liar as well, but I'll still read Windswept House just for the sake of entertaining it.
I'll break in there. The allegations about Malachi Martin and the women is mostly unfounded.
Oh, is it like Me Too stuff?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll grant that.
It's a long story, but I initially believed them and have since apologized. They're mostly unfounded from a journalist who made a claim that's not fully supportable. So so we don't get into some quagmire Vietnam on that. I would just say I don't find them altogether credible at this point. I don't know what you think about it, Xbox, but the Malachi.
Yeah, Malachi Martin. I don't know. I mean, I don't have a strong opinion of him or his work. I think some of the conspiratorial stuff, honestly, is like a cancer on the trad movement. That I'm not saying he's a bad guy or there's nothing there worth taking seriously, but I think the trads fixate on a lot of things like, and even these can be worth interpreting or interesting, but like Marian, like reading a lot into like Marian prophecies or the Siri thesis or other kind of conspiracy theories, instead of just attending to like the substantive core issues of the permissibility of doctrinal dissent and material disobedience and stuff like that. So I think the movement would be much helped if people were to avoid much of the sensationalism. I would say, as far as catechesis goes, I basically agree with Pinesap. I think most of the really pervasive errors today don't have anything straightforward to do with the teachings of Vatican II. You could argue maybe that some of this has to do with, in addition to failures of governance, which I think are very pervasive, and I suspect Pinesap would even agree with that. Like the German bishops are awful.
Oh, for sure.
But and that may authorize disobedience, extraordinary, acting outside, performing facially illegal acts in Germany, for example. I think maybe you would even agree. And arguably, those trends stem from Vatican II or heterodox readings of Vatican II, the spirit of Vatican II. But I think most of this is just terrible catechesis and religious indifferentism that the hierarchy is complicit in. But it's like whatever percentage of Americans believe in, or American Catholics believe in the real presence. It's like 33%. I think it's like 11% reject the permissibility, or 11% believe that contraception is contrary to natural law. And like certainly every post-conciliar pope would be outraged by that. So
moving on, we have American Reform sent $5 for Pinesap. How do you square permissions claim sacrilege in Canon 44 of 83 code with indefectibility?
I'm going to be so real. I'm not studying canon law. What I will do is I will go back, watch this episode and study that question more. And I'll do a Twitter post on it from my understanding. But canon law, I mean, I said earlier to Xbox, like sacramental theology and stuff like that, I'm terrible on. Canon law, I know virtually nothing about. So that's something I'm going to need to go investigate.
I just Googled it, so I can read it to you if you have like just like any reaction.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Not that I'll hold you to. You have to have a really thought through opinion. But here's Canon 844. That's what he cites, right? 44. Catholic ministers administer the sacraments licitly to Catholic members of the Christian faithful alone, who likewise receive them licitly from Catholic ministers alone without prejudice to previous canons. And then the second part of Canon 844, whenever necessity requires it or true spiritual advantage suggests it, and provided that danger of error or of indifferentism is avoided, the Christian faithful, for whom it is physically or morally impossible to approach a Catholic minister, are permitted to receive the sacraments of penance, Eucharist, anointing of the sick from non-Catholic ministers in whose church these sacraments are valid. So I think the permission is probably the second part of that. I don't know exactly what he's asking about sacrilege, but
I mean, honestly, what I would say for that is we actually, I think, believe it or not, the Transalpine Redemptorists, when they were in communion with the church, had a great thread on this. But, you know, if we're kind of basically talking about, I'm going to butcher the Latin. Xbox, is it communicatio in sacris? Intercommunion, basically.
Oh, I don't know what the Latin term is, but sure, yeah.
Yeah, or not intercommunion, but you know what I mean. Like if I went to an Orthodox priest or what have you, and there was no Catholic priest, and he gave me last rites or something like that. There are a ton of examples of this happening during the Crusades. There are like massive examples of that happening during the medieval period, especially because oftentimes what would occur was the schism, especially the Great Schism, was not very clearly accurate. For instance, like Alexandria, the Patriarchate of Alexandria was still in communion with the church even during Lateran IV, and sent representatives to the council and was admitted to the council and gave Latin merchants and crusaders Holy Communion when they were down there. So I think that, you know, looking back on sort of that history of the church, we see a very clear picture of examples where that was permitted, and the correct understanding of this does not mean that they're like somehow a part of the church, like as Catholics are, but that these men have material apostolic succession, and in these cases, a great necessity, they can be approached for those sacraments. That's what I would say with a cursory reading.
If I could interject, I completely agree with everything you said there. So even though he's like crazy, David Bentley Hart had a really good article about the history of intercommunion the sacraments from like 15 years ago or something. And obviously he's coming from like nominally an Eastern Orthodox perspective. I think he's like a crazy Gnostic now, but he just documents cases going back to the Crusades and well through the early modern period where this was universally accepted, both in Eastern Europe and in the Levant, of intercommunion the sacraments. I do think that the actual practice has gone way too far. It's gone beyond this. So one example that comes to mind is both John Paul II, he habitually did this, and Cardinal Ratzinger at John Paul II's funeral gave communion to a brother, Robert Schutz, who was at the Taizé community, and he was a Reformed pastor who was close personal friends with John Paul II. He was habitually receiving communion from Catholics at the Taizé community in Switzerland. And they said things like, well, yeah, he does reject obstinately certain Catholic doctrines, but he is like united with the church. And I find that very bizarre. And actually, who's like Pope Francis, like one of his official biographers, he's like a crazy lib. He thinks that like like anthropogenic climate change was dogmatized by Francis. I'm forgetting his name, but he wrote an article in American magazine back in 2005 where he was saying like, oh, this suggests the broader permissibility of giving communion to Protestants habitually without grave necessity. I think that's very concerning.
I will say, though, I'm positive I saw subsequent evidence when that contention was brought up that Schutz actually did convert to Catholicism. I think it was actually confirmed that he did become a part of the church. He was initially Reformed, but he had actually drawn into the Catholic Church a little later on. I can't remember what period of time it was, but I think prior to him receiving Holy Communion, he had already been a part of the Catholic Church in an official sense, like actually received in.
This was a rumor that was reported because there was huge controversy in 2005 when Ratzinger gave him communion at JP2's funeral. And I looked into this a bit, and it is ambiguous. It is very strange. But I think that the Vatican publicly denied that, and his successor in Taizé, I'm just looking up now, Brother Alois, he confirmed that Rogers had habitually received the Eucharist from Catholics at Taizé while he remained a Reformed minister, and he denied that he ever formally converted. He merely affirmed the Nicene Creed.
I want to look up more information on that because, Catholics at Taizé might have very well given him the Eucharist without, permission or proper clearance to do so. I might fully grant that. But in terms of the actual popes, I think I saw that he had already converted. So let me look up more on that. Something I did want to say, though, send me that David Bentley Hart article. That sounds really good.
Yeah, I read it a few years ago, but I'll look for it after the debate. Yeah.
Dude, thank you so much. That really means a lot to me.
Just send me a reminder. Yeah, no worries. Thanks.
Okay, moving on to Bjorn Ringdahl 988 sent 50, and he said, I commend the participants for the very civil and friendly manner in which this interesting debate has been conducted.
As do I. No, you guys both did well.
And Drew Black said, sent $50, said, love this discussion. Thank you. Sir Totally Average sent $10. How do you square the idea that the Novus Ordo is supposedly a form, but is treated like a rite? And if it is just a form, what does it change? Why does it change so much and seem to lack a hermeneutic of continuity?
What does he mean by a form versus a rite? Oh, like ordinary form versus extraordinary form, or I'm not really understanding the
only rite with two forms is the Roman rite, and so Pope Francis would regularly refer to it as bi-ritualism, but it's not, because technically it's one rite with two forms, but it's sui generis in that capacity. None of the other rites have two forms, and it is kind of odd.
What I would say with that is that, St. Paul VI, when he issued the Novus Ordo Missae, said that this was a continuation of the Roman rite, and that thus the subsequent celebration, the TLM, is also a celebration of the Roman rite. And so it's kind of this historical situation where, if the Holy Father says this also is a continuation of the Roman rite, but of course, the Missal of St. John the 23rd is also an expression of that Roman rite, it wouldn't thus make it two different rites. And so it would belong to the same rite, being different forms. Now, again, amongst change or seeming to lack the hermeneutic of continuity, the Vatican, contrary to what people think, has actually tried to intervene a lot more in the liturgy than many realize. But the problem is that a lot of that intervention sometimes goes unenforced in dioceses where, I think me and Tim have talked about this. Susan from the parish council will just bend the ear of the bishop and be like, no, I actually want sloppy guitar Elvis mass, and I don't really care what the Vatican says. So it's really sort of a widespread abuse, not something that is actively encouraged by the Vatican to be an abuse, right? They have actually tried to intervene multiple times and said this is a beautiful expression of the mass. I mean, for instance, in Colorado, we're very blessed. We have a ton of Novus Ordo parishes here that are bursting at the seams, new converts, very traditional people, all well catechized. and they are celebrating the Novus Ordo Missae according to the dictates of the Vatican. And the ones that dissent from it, like one parish I can think of is like Our Lady of the Pines. It's like, again, contrary to the wishes of the Vatican. So it's more of a disciplinary issue rather than something belonging to the heart of the Mass itself.
Yeah, I think that the vocabulary and taxonomy for classifying the Mass of Paul VI has been all over the place, both from Paul VI himself at various points referred to it either as just the Roman Rite, the form of the Roman Rite, or he referred to it elsewhere as a new rite, the new rite of the Mass. And there's a subsequent exposition by liturgists, like Roman liturgists in good standing, and subsequent popes alternated in their expressions. I think there's just a lot of confusion and ambiguity about how to classify the Mass of Paul VI. I think that one basic assumption that needs to be clarified, though, is like Benedict XVI is really great on this, that the Pope is the servant of tradition and is subject to liturgical law in guarding the liturgy and guarding the liturgy as a part of sacred tradition. And he cannot construct the rite of the Mass from nothing, from the ground up. And Benedict XVI, at the time, Cardinal Ratzinger, positively reviewed both Monsignor Klaus Gamber's books on the Roman Rite, and in the French preface to the French translation of Gamber's book on the Roman Rite, he referred to the Novus Ordo as a banal fabrication by a committee. And he also positively reviewed Dom Elso Reed's book on the organic development of the liturgy. And in both cases, they think that the Pope is materially constrained in his alteration of the rite. And this would raise up further questions about like Mediator Dei and what does Pius XII say about the Pope's authority over the liturgy. But I just think that it's important to stay away from a positivist view that the Pope can construct the rite without any constraints whatsoever. And as long as he designates it the Roman Rite, there is substantial continuity. I think that the label or the taxonomy is less important than the substantial continuity of the matter of the liturgy itself, which I believe there's a substantial rupture.
And moving on to Mr. Kingsley, who sent $10. Before Vatican II, how influential have Protestants, Jews, and Masons been in the formation and traditions of the Catholic Mass?
Oh, apparently Mike Lewis is in chat right now. Interesting. Let's see. So before Vatican II, how influential have Protestants, Jews, and Masons been for? I would say not at all. And again, if you're affirming that about Vatican II, I'm going to be very blunt here. That's just not true whatsoever. In 1976, I think there literally was a question issued to the Holy Office or the CDF about the involvement of Masons or Protestants, and there was a denial that they had any direct involvement in the construction of the liturgy. I know the SSPX likes to refer to like this one Lutheran guy that says that they were super involved. But again, the official organ of the Vatican says no, they were just observers and stuff like that. And for anyone who's scandalized about observers being there, I mean, keep in mind, Protestants were invited to the Council of Trent. And this is the most shocking of all. And this is a really cool historical fact. The Mongols were invited to the Second Council of Lyon. So like literal pagans were invited to the Second Council of Lyon, but didn't, of course, have any sway on the actual council's proceedings. As regards to the involvement of Jews, as beautifully E. Michael Jones, despite his other misinterpreted views on like race or what have you, Jews were very disappointed with the result Nostra Aetate. They didn't feel like it expressed, again, this dual covenant salvific theology that they wanted to usher in. Gregory Baum, I mean, basically all his work on the first draft was thrown out, and Father John Oesterreicher was a more prevalent figure over Nostra Aetate, and he was very orthodox. In fact, they called him, his nickname, because he wanted to convert Jews, was the Inquisitor, right? And he upheld that mission his entire life. And so his view was the predominant one, and that's why Gavin DaCosta, in his Oxford Press work, Jews, Muslims, and Vatican II, almost explicitly on the chapter on Judaism, solely refers to Father John Oesterreicher, because he was the prevalent theologian. He was a great Orthodox man, and I've been very encouraged by his work.
Yeah, I do believe that there were several Lutheran advisors who participated in the construction of the liturgy. It wasn't one observer. I think it was several, but I'd have to look into that. There were Jewish observers, but I don't know that they had a direct hand in the construction of the liturgy or if they were just consulted. I think one of the Eucharistic prayers, which is an option for a priest to use, the one that refers to the work of human hands, is drawn from a rabbinic meal blessing, which postdates our Lord. The Masonic stuff, I don't know. I mean, people claim that Annibale Bugnini was a Mason and that his name was like on the rolls that got leaked in like the lodge in Turin or Milan or something. I'm pretty skeptical about that because I think I may have heard that from like Father Hesse or something who was very sensationalist. So I don't know what to think about that. But he definitely did when Annibale Bugnini said that his intention in the construction of the new Mass was to remove barriers to communion with our separated brethren, the Protestants, and to remove anything that would be considered offensive to them. I don't know the exact quote, but it's something like that, paraphrasing. So I think that the question less is like, was a Lutheran minister consulted in the construction of the Mass? Then what was the defining intention that would govern the construction of the Mass, which is a reason for suspicion.
Lumen Gentium,
I think
paragraph 67, tells theologians and preachers to, quote, carefully refrain from whatever might lead the separated brethren into error regarding the true doctrine of the church. This has been proffered since the council as an excuse for the failure to announce the fifth Marian dogma. Also, section 54 of Lumen Gentium, significant. At the beginning of the Marian chapter, the council says it, quote, does not, however, intend to give a complete doctrine on Mary, nor does it wish to decide those questions, which the work of theologians is not yet fully clarified. Again, this seems pretty objectively and universally to be a genuflection before Protestantism, just to throw that in there.
What I would say about Annibale Bugnini specifically is I know some Australian sisters did fantastic work on actually the Mass of All Ages and showing some of the distortions that, despite some of the incredible beauty in the documentary, I think it was the second part that they did their own 15-minute documentary on, including clarifying that quote that Bugnini had. Bugnini most certainly was definitely more on the ecumenical side, but that stumbling block quote is oftentimes taken out of context. Not to mention Yves Chiron, who is, I mean, he's got trad credentials up the wazoo, and has written really, really good biographies of Pius IX, Pius X, Annibale Bugnini, and St. Paul VI. And I should say Blessed Pius IX and St. Pius X. I don't want people to think, oh, you don't think they're saints, but they are. He, I think, struck down the charge that Bugnini was a Freemason, even in that work. He says that he, of course, was definitely more ecumenical, but I think he found from the actual evidence that he was not a Mason. If memory serves me right, I might be wrong on that.
That may well be true. I'm not sure.
All right. Sincerely, good job to both of you. I found that more enlightening than any other SSPX debate I've heard, which means I render the indefectibility locus a success. So good job, both of you. Thank you to both of you sincerely. And if either you want to take a parting shot or plug something, tell people where they can find you, then take a minute and do so now.
Well, for me, I'm Feels Guy 2003 on Twitter. There's this weird new account that's cropped back up on Instagram. It's me, Spruce Juice 2988. For those who don't know, my original Instagram got banned. I think it was after the ADL started to hound Instagram about having Groiper accounts on there. So that's my new one. And then, of course, you can find me on YouTube, Pinesap, Rumble, Pinesap, Kick, Pinesap, and I'm on all those subsequent platforms. And I had a great time with Xbox. Super respectful dude. I really felt like this was a great meeting of minds.
Yeah, thanks so much. I had a great time, and I thought Pinesap made excellent arguments, comported himself very admirably in the debate, and was very polite to me. So I really appreciated that. And I thought it was a robust and substantive debate. I'm just on Twitter at XboxLive GOP. So, but yeah, thanks so much for hosting this, and thank you for participating.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tim.
I think Tim's muted.
Oh, I think
you're muted.
Sorry, I keep having to mute to avoid the echo. Yeah, thanks to both of you, and everyone give both Xbox Live Republican and Connor, who's at Feels Guy on Twitter, a follow. And God bless you all. Have a happy Holy Friday, and don't eat meat today. God bless.